All right, guys, welcome. And we are back for day 3 of the state of New Mexico versus Hannah Gutierrez. So, first off, I want to apologize. Last night we did not get to do the Justice Watch Live show. Unfortunately, I had some things come up, so I do apologize for that. If anybody saw obviously the announcement that we were going to be doing that. So I am sorry that we didn't get a chance to do that. Like I said, we had some unforeseeable things come up that just didn't allow us to go live. Sometimes that's going to happen. But tonight, goal is to go live after court at 9. We've got a lot to catch up on. We got the Paul Ferguson sentencing happened today, so we'll be talking about that. We've got other things to watch and do, so that'll be exciting. But right now, court has begun. We're a little bit behind, but we're going to jump in there and catch the get started watching. We're speeded up a little bit just to get caught up so we can be live. But we're going to be starting out with day 3. As I said, first 2 days in the bag. My opinion right now is that Hannah Gutierrez, in her defense, are not ahead in this case. I don't think it's impossible for them to get caught back up. But I think that one of the damning things that we saw was the videotape, the body cam, where she's saying, oh fuck, I messed up. I'm sorry. That does not look good, given the condition of the crime scene, given the things we saw, given the fact that there were live bullets scattered throughout that crime scene. That is not good for her as being responsible. Now, we've got to give her defense a chance to put on their case, continue cross-examining. We got to see the rest of this case, and we've got to continue to provide her with a presumption of innocence. But that doesn't look good in a case of negligence when you're apologizing to the police when they arrive and you're apologizing to others. And you can almost see the one lady that testified last week. She was almost as if to say, slow down, watch what you're saying. And they of course got a lawyer on scene right away. But there's lots more to find out, lots more to see. So that's where we're going to go from. So let's jump into the courtroom right now. We're going to get started here. Give me a moment. And we will jump into the courtroom. Here we go. So let's get to where we have some sound here.
Good morning, Jason Gold.
Face the judge and raise your right hand.
Do you swear affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you'll give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. Have a seat. Talk into the microphone.
Mr. Zig.
Not sure why there was no sound there, but we're going to reload this. All right, so let me get this loaded up now. I apologize for the technical difficulties here. Let's get this thing loaded up.
Affirmative penalty of law that the testimony you'll give in this case will be the truth.
All right, we are up. Right, so we're going to run a little bit fast right now to get caught up for the live. Shouldn't take long.
Is your microphone on? Yes. Okay. Mr. Ziegler, go ahead and just state your full name for the record.
My name is Bryce Ziegler. First name spelled B-R-Y-C-E. Last name spelled Z-I-E-G-L-E-R.
Mr. Ziegler, how are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation within the Laboratory Division, specifically within the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit.
Can you give the jury a summary of your educational background and training?
I received a Bachelor's of Science in Forensic Science from the Pennsylvania State University.
And how long have you worked for the FBI?
Since the summer of 2011.
And Since 2011, what positions have you held at the FBI?
I was initially hired into one of the DNA units at the laboratory, and I essentially worked as what's called a technician in that discipline. So I essentially did the majority of the DNA processing operations, but then an examiner would come in, review my work, review the profiles, and take it from there. In 2015, I transferred to the Firearms Toolmarks unit, which is where I am now, and I was also promoted to a forensic examiner. So in this current position, I receive evidence that's related to my discipline, I perform the requested examinations on those items of evidence, and I issue the results in a formal laboratory report. And also, if I'm called to, I can testify to those results.
And, sir, other than your undergraduate degree, what kind of training do you have in the area of firearms and tool marks?
In order to become a qualified forensic examiner in this discipline, I had to complete what's called the Forensic Examiner Training Program. And that program, it's developed and implemented by the FBI lab, and it's specific to each particular unit. So I had to complete the program specific for firearms and tool marks. And this program, so I was assigned a mentor, and I was also given a training manual. So this mentor kind of guided me through the process, reviewed tasks in that training manual with me, and to essentially complete that process, I had to pass a series of written examinations, oral board exercises, practical competency tests, as well as moot court exercises.
Thank you, sir. And have you ever been qualified as an expert?
In court?
In court, yes.
Yes, I have.
And in what areas have you been qualified as an expert?
Some of those are general firearms examinations. Sometimes it's firearms identification, so that's the microscopic comparison of fired ammunition components back to firearms. I've also been qualified in shooting incident reconstruction.
And in terms of shooting incident reconstruction, did you do that kind of work in this case?
No, I did not.
And I apologize, we were having a technical difficulty here. In terms of the work that you did on this case, what areas of expertise have you been qualified as an expert in that apply to this case?
Sure. I would say those two areas are the examination of firearms and also firearms identification.
Okay, thank you, sir. We will ask the court to recognize. Well, you know what? Let me pause. Have you testified before?
Yes, I have.
And have you been qualified as an expert in other courts?
Yes, I have.
And how many other courts have qualified you as an expert?
13.
And are those all federal courts or state courts?
10 of those are federal, 3 were state.
Okay, thank you. I would ask the court to recognize Mr. Ziegler as an expert in firearms examination and firearms
Identification.
Thank you, identification.
All right, you are recognized as an expert in examination of firearms and firearm identification.
Now, it's okay, thanks, you can see. In this particular case, were you provided certain items of evidence for testing?
Yes, I was.
And approximately how many items of evidence were you provided for testing?
That's difficult to approximate because I was given a certain number of item numbers, but those item numbers may have, for example, 30 cartridges. So I believe that item numbers, I would say maybe around 50 items, but again, that could mean a much larger set of items.
Were you provided a firearm to examine in this case?
Yes, I was.
And did you have any understanding where that firearm came from?
I don't have personal knowledge of where the items of evidence are submitted from. They are generally submitted with some information that gets populated into our laboratory database. So I do have a description of that. That information gets populated into my lab report, but I don't have direct knowledge of where those items came from.
So what was your understanding, and I appreciate your qualification there, what was your understanding of where the firearm in this case came from that you administered some testing on?
So in this case, it was just labeled as a revolver. There was no description as to, for example, no address where that firearm was collected from.
You weren't given any information about whether it was collected from a movie set or whether it was a prop being used by an actor?
Your Honor, I object to leading.
Actually, I think that is leading.
Overruled.
I don't have that information.
Okay. I'm going to show you, what I have marked as State's Exhibit 97.
Larger set of items.
Were you provided a firearm to examine in this case?
Yes, I was.
And did you have any understanding where that firearm came from?
I don't have personal knowledge of where the items of evidence are submitted from. They are generally submitted with some information that gets populated into our laboratory database. So I do have a description of that. That information gets populated into my lab report, but I don't have direct knowledge of where those items came from.
So what was your understanding, and I appreciate your qualification there, what was your understanding of where the firearm in this case came from that you administered some testing on?
So in this case, it was just labeled as a revolver. There was no description as to, for example, no address where that firearm was collected from.
You weren't given any information about whether it was collected from a movie set or whether it was a prop being used by an actor?
Your Honor, I object to leading.
Actually, I think that is leading.
Overruled.
I don't have that information.
Okay. I'm going to show you, what I have marked as State's Exhibit 97. May I approach? Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
What's
Your
that?
Honor, may I see that?
Mr. Mr. Ziegler, what did I just show you?
That is a photograph of the revolver that was submitted to my laboratory for examination.
Is this a revolver that you did testing on?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I'm going to move for the admission of State's Exhibit 97 and ask for permission to publish.
No objection.
All right, States 97 is admitted. You may publish. It was on this one before.
And can I ask, is there any way for me to only publish to that monitor so that I don't have to walk back and forth? Just to his monitor, so that it only goes to his and doesn't go to everybody else's when I'm going through the exhibits.
No, if it's published, well. You mean to recognize it?
Correct.
We'd have to keep turning it on and off.
Okay.
Or else you could, yeah, that's what we'd have to do.
Okay. Why don't we just take a minute and let me see if I can get an agreement so that we don't have to do that.
Okay.
All right. 97A, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110.
So is it 97A through 110? Did you skip anything?
97, 97A, and then 98 through 110.
No objection.
All right, States 97 through 110 are admitted.
Every time we unplug it. All right, Mr. Ziegler, can we go ahead and put it up on the screen?
Yes.
Mr. Ziegler, tell us a little bit about this firearm that was provided to you. What kind of a gun is it? And just generally speaking, how does a gun like this operate?
So this is an image, a photograph of the revolver that was submitted, and this is a single-action revolver. So that means that the hammer must be manually cocked by the shooter every time that the shooter intends to fire. So some revolvers, if you pull the trigger, it will do the work of cocking the hammer for you and releasing the hammer. This type of firearm does not have that ability. The shooter must physically cock the hammer each time. Is this a touchscreen by chance?
Yes.
Okay. So to point out a few key areas of this firearm, the portion on the left, don't believe him.
He's going to come help you.
Thank you. So the portion on the left in this photograph is the barrel. Towards the center, we have the cylinder. This back portion here is the hammer. We have the trigger near the bottom, and this wooden piece is the grip. So this is where you would hold the firearm. Let's clear this out. So basically, in order to get this firearm to function, you would have to load cartridges into the cylinder. This can be accomplished two ways. You can't see it in this photograph, but on the opposite side is what's called a loading gate. You can open, and you then have access to the cylinder. So you can load each cartridge one at a time, rotating the cylinder until you have as many cartridges as you desire. You could also remove this pin here, remove the cylinder from the firearm, and load it that way. But regardless, once you load the cylinder, you must manually cock the hammer all the way to the rear, and then at this point, this firearm will be ready to fire. So a pull of the trigger would release the firearm, or excuse me, the hammer. The hammer has a firing pin that's fixed to the hammer, so as the hammer falls, the firing pin will strike the primer of the cartridge and fire that cartridge.
Can you give us a quick description about the notches on the hammer and the different hammer positions?
Yeah, so as you would cock this hammer, it has several safety notches by design. So as you cock it, you're going to hear a series of clicks, and those are the safety notches. So as you start to cock it, you're going to hear your first click, that's the quarter cock notch. If you continue to cock it, you'll hear your second click, that's the half cock notch. And if you cock it all the way, you'll hear the third click, and that's when it's in its fully cocked position. So those intermediate two cocking positions, they serve to do two things. Number one, when the hammer is completely at rest or not cocked at all, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So it's very difficult to see here, but in between this gap, between the cylinder and the frame, you would actually be able to see the firing pin sticking out. So as you start to cock it, it starts to remove the firing pin from protruding. So we don't want the firing pin making contact with the cartridges when we don't want it to. So it starts to retract the firing pin, and also if I'm cocking the hammer and my thumb slips off the hammer, you would expect that it's going to catch in one of those two safety notches. So this is to prevent the hammer from falling unless you want it to. So really this firearm is only designed to fire when the hammer is in its fully cocked position.
In terms of well, let me ask you this, the half cock notch, so that's going to be the second click that you hear when you're cocking the hammer, is that correct?
Correct.
Is there anything particular about the half cock position other than it being a safety?
Can you elaborate?
Sure. What position does the hammer have to be in order to load this gun with ammunition?
I understand. So you have to have the hammer retracted to a certain point to allow the cylinder to rotate freely. So there's a part, and it's on the inside here, called the cylinder stop, and that cylinder stop does not unlock until the hammer is pulled back to a certain point. So once it's pulled back to a certain degree, you can freely rotate the cylinder to load it with as many cartridges as you desire.
So in order to load and unload this gun, if you don't remove the pin and remove the cylinder, it has to be in the half cock position.
I'm not sure if it's somewhere between the quarter and the half cock, but it is in that intermediate area, yes.
So once you get it into the half cock position, what do you have to do to load it?
So I'll clear this out. Again, on the other side, there's a loading gate that you can open, and you then have access to the cylinder, so you can load it that way. Or remove the cylinder itself.
How many cylinder positions do you have access to when you open that loading gate?
Only one at a time, so you must manually rotate the cylinder and continue to load a single cartridge at a time.
So for those of us that are familiar with revolvers where you push a button and the entire cylinder kind of rolls out and you can load and unload that way, does this gun work that way?
No, those are going to be your more modern style revolvers.
If you noticed when you received this gun and you examined this gun, did this gun appear to be very old or relatively new, or were you not able to tell?
I'm not able to tell its age now.
Okay. Who is the manufacturer of this revolver?
The trade name is Pieta. It's an Italian company.
And do you know anything about Pieta and what they do, what they make?
I do know they have product lines they create new firearms that are essentially replicas of older firearms.
Is this a replica?
It's a replica in that it's an old design, but it's still a functioning firearm.
Now, if the hammer, let's talk about kind of hypothetically. Let's assume that this gun is fully loaded with live ammunition, and we have the hammer in its resting position, so it's fully down. Is that the position it's in this photo?
Yes, it appears so.
So, how is this gun designed in terms of safety with regard to possible accidental discharges when the hammer is in the fully rested position?
Right, so when the hammer is fully forward, as I mentioned earlier, the firing pin actually protrudes inside the frame. So if you have the cylinder fully loaded and the hammer is at rest on a chamber that has a live cartridge in it, that firing pin is actually sitting on the primer of that cartridge. So if I were either to strike the hammer or if I were to drop it and it landed on the hammer, it's going to fire that cartridge. So if you hit the hammer with enough force, it will detonate that primer in that position. And that's part of the design of this firearm. That's just how these are made. And if you were to look at the owner's manual, which this is one thing I did as part of my exam, you would actually see warnings not to carry this firearm with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber. So a lot of times it's actually advised that you load one less cartridge in the cylinder, so you have one empty chamber, and that's how it's carried with the hammer forward on that chamber. So these are recommendations in the owner's manual. So this isn't some phenomenon, this is something that's known about the design of these firearms.
And what kind of testing did you perform on this firearm?
So initially I did a function evaluation just to make sure it appeared that there weren't any odd modifications, that it was functioning correctly. After that, I was requested to do some microscopic comparisons, as I was also submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case. And then the last type of testing I did on this particular gun is what's called accidental discharge testing. So essentially the goal of that test is to see if I can get this firearm to function without pulling the trigger.
So the first set of testing that you mentioned, what did that entail?
So function examination is basically I need to inspect the firearm for safety purposes. Keep in mind I've never seen this firearm before when I first opened the box, so I don't know what condition it's been in, I don't know how old it is, I don't know how well it's been taken care of. So eventually I'm going to want to test fire that gun, so I need to make sure I feel that it's safe to fire so I don't have some catastrophic failure while I do so. Once I determine that it is safe to fire, I will physically take the gun to one of two locations in the FBI lab, and I will load it with ammunition from the laboratory and actually test fire the gun.
And did you test fire this gun?
Yes, I did.
Approximately how many rounds of ammunition did you fire out of this gun?
May I refer to my report?
Sure.
I physically fired this gun 12 times, so as a result of that, I retained the fired bullet and fired cartridge cases that I produced during that test firing. And I also collected some other cartridge cases as a product of the testing that I did. So these would be cartridge cases that I collected during the accidental discharge testing.
And the rounds that you fired, the 12 rounds that you fired out of this gun, were they evidence rounds or were those rounds that were supplied by the FBI?
They were FBI cartridges, and then once I fire them in the evidence firearm, they become what's called secondary evidence. And essentially, if I have to conduct microscopic comparisons at a later point, that secondary evidence, they now become my knowns. I know they came from that firearm because I physically shot it and collected those items.
All right, thank you. Tell us about the second group of testing that you did.
Right, that was the microscopic comparisons. So again, I was submitted a fired bullet and a fired cartridge case, and essentially I was asked to determine if, in my opinion, I could determine if those two items were fired by this particular revolver.
Okay, and let me back you up for a moment. Did you examine rounds of ammunition as a part of your forensic examination in this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you examine dummy rounds?
Yes, I did.
Did you examine live rounds?
Yes.
Did you examine live rounds? Well, did you examine live rounds that you understood to be provided by someone named Seth Kinney?
Yes, there were some cartridges that were submitted, and they were declared to be live rounds as they were submitted.
Did you examine live ammunition that came from a location that you were notified was 126 Monroe Street?
Your Honor, I object to leading.
I'm not leading, I'm just asking him a direct question.
Overruled.
May I review my...
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, I do have some item numbers that have that address in their item description.
Did you also examine live ammunition that came from the set of the movie Rust?
Yes, I did.
And when you examined that ammunition, what did that entail?
So the evaluation of the ammunition kind of took place in a couple different phases. So first, I just looked at the physical characteristics. So I evaluated its appearance from the outside. And based on that, I started to segregate these types of ammunition into groups just based on their physical appearance. So I could put them into groups. For example, some of them appeared to be live cartridges, so I had that group. Some of them appeared to be dummy rounds. And so they may have some physical visual clue that they may be a dummy. So for instance, some of them had holes drilled into the side of them. So I could look into the cartridge and see there was no powder present. Some of them, when you shake them, there are actual BBs inside. So that produces an audible indicator that even though this looks to be a live cartridge, in reality there's nothing on the inside. So I can shake it, and that's another indicator that that may be a dummy. There were a series of blanks, which a blank does not have a bullet. It still has a primer and gas, but it's not meant to actually fire a projectile. So I started to form these groups just based on their physical characteristics. I then x-rayed all the ammunition because I could hear some of these cartridges it sounded like BBs inside when you shook them. So I wanted to get an idea of just a picture of what was going on inside these cartridges. So again, I took those two pieces of information, sorted them into groups, and then eventually I worked with the contributor to determine which of these cartridges actually need to be disassembled. So we can take out the bullet and we can look inside and see, is there any powder present? Does it look like the primer is active or not? So those were kind of the three phases to sort of determine which categories these cartridges actually fell into.
Okay, and quickly I'm going to jump you to the accidental discharge testing that you did. Can you summarize for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what that accidental discharge testing consisted of and why you did that testing?
Right, so again, accidental discharge, its goal is essentially to determine, can I fire this firearm without pulling the trigger? That's kind of the end goal. And the way we do that is the test is designed to simulate the firearm being bumped or banged into something, just being jostled around, and seeing can those kind of interactions fire the firearm. So the way we replicate this in the laboratory is I will take the gun and actually strike it with a rawhide mallet on 6 planes. So if you picture a box sitting in front of you, the 6 planes would be the front of the box, the rear of the box, the left side, the right side, the top, and the bottom. So those are the 6 planes. So if you kind of picture the revolver and picture how those 6 planes work around that gun, I'm going to go around and strike the firearm in all 6 of those planes with a rawhide mallet. Again, trying to determine if it will actually fire without me touching the trigger.
And specifically, when you're striking the firearm, are you striking the hammer?
That was a part of the testing that I did, yes.
Prior to conducting that testing, did you have any thoughts about whether that could potentially result in damage to the gun?
Right, so this is actually in our standard operating procedures, that this type of testing is potentially destructive to the firearm. So just kind of generally speaking, if I'm going to do an exam that may destroy or alter the evidence permanently, I would seek out the contributor's permission to do that exam before I actually go and do it. So that is what was done in this case.
So you obtained permission to proceed with that testing,
That's correct.
understanding that it could result in damage.
Yes.
All right. Let's go ahead and, let's go ahead and just briefly describe the striking of the mallet and whether or not at some point there was damage and kind of what you learned during that test.
So as we're doing this test, we want to test the firearm in all modes of fire that it's capable of. So if I have a rifle, for instance, and say it's semi-automatic and fully automatic, I would do the test in both of those settings. In this case, completely different type of firearm, but I wanted to test this gun in all 4 positions of the hammer. So at rest, quarter cock, half cock, and fully cocked. And essentially as a result of that testing, there were only 2 times that I was able to get this firearm to fire. The first one being when the hammer was at rest on a loaded chamber. So as I previously described to you, the firing pin was sitting directly on the primer. So when I struck the hammer with the mallet, that provided enough force to detonate the primer. So again, that's a known feature of this type of firearm. The second test where this occurred was when the hammer was in the fully cocked position, and I was doing my striking in the 6 planes as I described, and eventually I got to the rear of the firearm, so that back plane, and eventually at some point I struck the hammer with a rawhide mallet, and the hammer actually fell and it detonated the primer. So what happened was some of the internal components of the firearm actually broke to allow that hammer to fall and fire the primed cartridge case. So I previously mentioned those quarter and half cock notches. If the hammer were to fall and there was no damage inside the gun, I would expect that the portion that makes contact with the hammer is called the sear. That sear should have been caught either by the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was falling. It should not have been able to fall all the way. So this is what led me to believe that there was some type of damage that occurred within the gun. And eventually I disassembled it to figure out exactly what that damage was.
So the damage that you discovered, just so we're clear, was that damage sustained at the FBI lab?
Yes, it was.
Based on the testing that you did, when this gun was received by the FBI, was it in proper working order?
Yes, so the first exam I did was the function exam. So again, that's making sure it's operating correctly and that it hasn't been modified. During that test, I also examined the safeties. So as it was received in that condition, when I went through the function evaluation, everything appeared to be operating correctly. So it functioned normally as it was designed.
So you were able to make it fire in the resting position, correct?
That's correct.
And then did you put it in the quarter cock position?
Yes.
And did you strike it with a mallet?
In that particular case, for the quarter as well as the half cock, I did not need to do the mallet testing.
What kind of testing did you do?
So the quarter and half cock notches are not designed to essentially lock the trigger, put your firearm completely in a safe setting. So again, they're designed that if your finger slips off the hammer, it's going to catch it. So in this type of gun, if your hammer is in either the quarter or the half cock, you can actually squeeze the trigger, and if you squeeze it hard enough, it's going to cock the hammer enough that it releases. So you can still make the hammer fall even though it's in these two intermediate safety positions if you apply sufficient pressure to the trigger. So I did a variety of testing to determine if I put the hammer in the quarter cock as well as the half cock notch and I squeeze the trigger hard enough that I allow the hammer to fall, is it even feasible for the hammer to detonate the cartridge? And I determined in both of those positions it was not.
And we understand that the next testing that you did was in the full cock position.
That's correct.
And ultimately, as you predicted, was the gun damaged?
As a result of the testing, yes, it was damaged.
Okay. Let's move to State's Exhibit 97A. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, so this is a photograph that I took after the accidental discharge testing was complete. So on the right-hand side, we have the hammer. As I mentioned before, the firing pin is fixed to the hammer, so that's that piece that you see protruding from the hammer. In the top left, this piece is called the cylinder stop. So you can see a piece of that component fractured off. The bottom left here, we have the trigger, and this tiny piece here is what actually fractured off the trigger. Now, as I mentioned before, I explained the quarter and half cock notches, so I'm actually going to point those out to you. On the hammer, these kind of jagged edges, the first one is the quarter cock notch. So as you're cocking the hammer, you hear that first click. That is the sear portion of the trigger, which is now broken, locking into that little recess. Your second click is the half cock notch, so that's that second jagged edge. And then your last click is the actual sear notch. So that's where the trigger is sitting when the hammer is in its fully cocked position. So when I struck the hammer with the mallet, it actually broke off that piece of the trigger that was sitting up against the hammer there.
And is there anything unusual to you in this photo about the full cock notch on the hammer?
So again, this notch here is the full cock notch. So you may notice when looking at this that this notch appears much flatter when you compare it to the other two notches. So it could be that a small portion of this surface was also damaged during the testing. But in addition to that, there are times where the sear notch is just not as pronounced as the other two notches. So I didn't observe any damage myself in this particular area, but it's possible that that area was damaged as well.
And based on your testing, did you form an opinion about whether or not this gun could be fired without the handler pulling the trigger?
So again, the only two times that occurred was with the hammer at rest on a loaded chamber, and the second time I attributed this to the breakage of internal components. So again, if these parts had not broken, I would expect that the trigger should have been caught by either the quarter or the half cock notch as the hammer was coming forward. So I would not expect this to occur had this breakage not happened.
So just to be clear, did you form an opinion about whether the handler would have to pull the trigger of the gun to make the gun fire?
My opinion is that the only reason this occurred is because of the breakage. So in order to move the trigger away from the hammer, that's typically accomplished by pulling the trigger. So in this case, the only way that was possible is because the trigger actually fractured.
Okay. So in order for you, just so that we're clear, in order for you to make the gun fire without pulling the trigger, when it was in the full cock position, you had to break it.
That's what I had to do in my lab. I can't account for all the other possibilities that may have existed in some hypothetical scenario, but this is the result as I tested it in my laboratory. It would not fire without pulling the trigger in the full cock setting without being broken.
Thank you. Let's move to State's Exhibit 98. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is a photograph of the fired bullet that was submitted for comparison.
And can you describe to us in a little bit more detail what we're seeing in this photo?
This is the lead bullet that was submitted. It's very damaged. So typically, when I look at a fired bullet, I would expect to see nice areas
What we just heard is bad news for Alec Baldwin.
Of the barrel.
Very bad news.
So I
for
expect
Alec
to see, for example, deep lines that define what we call the rifling. And in this case, I don't see that. I just see a series of abrasions on the outside of this bullet. So essentially, whatever this bullet came into contact with, it basically damaged the exterior surface so greatly that the information that was left behind from the barrel is gone.
When you're talking about what the bullet came in contact with, I just want to be clear, are you talking about what the bullet came in contact with after it left the barrel of the gun?
That's correct.
State's Exhibit 99. Explain to us what we're looking at here.
So these are just additional images of the same fired bullet. So I took these using my microscope, so they're a little bit higher magnification. And basically, in both of these photos, the bullet is pointing to the left. So you're looking at the image of the left, you're looking at all of the damage and abrasions that were present on that bullet when I received it. And the image on the right is similar to the one you saw on the previous slide, where it doesn't have the deep gouges in different directions, but the rifling is still virtually gone from this bullet.
Can you tell us what caliber this bullet is?
When we receive fired bullets, the only way we can estimate the caliber is based on the diameter, so I can measure the diameter of the bullet, and also the bullet weight. So for those two items, they were very close between a .44 caliber and a .45 caliber bullet. So I classified it as either a .44 or .45 caliber bullet.
Can you explain to us why a .45 caliber bullet, by the time it gets to you, may have a different diameter and weight?
Sure, so this projectile is lead, which is a relatively soft material. Most modern bullets are going to have a harder jacketing material, so it's going to have a lead core with a harder jacket around it. The most common type is going to be copper, and that harder material is going to protect the lead core. It's going to help it keep its mass as it starts hitting things. But because this is lead, it's relatively soft, it's much more susceptible to damage when it hits things. So it's possible that when I receive a bullet or even a bullet fragment, and I go to take a measurement of that bullet, it may be less than the true measurement because it's hit things and I now only have a partial bullet. Or conversely, it could actually be a wider diameter because it hits something and it flattens, so that causes it to expand. So that's why when I'm taking that measurement into consideration, I may not be able to narrow it down to just one specific caliber.
And State's Exhibit 100, what's this?
These are 2 images of the fired cartridge case that was submitted for the examination. So the left image is from the side, and the right image you're looking at what's called the head stamp of the cartridge. So the head stamp itself is the outer ring where you're going to see information such as the caliber. So 45 Colt is the caliber. You may also see symbols which relate to the manufacturer. And then this silver colored surface in the center here is the primer that I've been talking about. So this is what the firing pin comes into contact with when you pull the trigger. So this crater in the center, that's the firing pin impression. So when the firing pin falls, strikes the primer,
I agree.
it leaves behind an
But I
impression
think
of the firing pin.
I think the
And
defense
also
for
during the
her is
firing
going to
pin
be centered more
the firing
around
process, the
trying
cartridge
to
case
say she
rests
wasn't
up against
responsible
a
for certain
flat
things
surface
in her
called the breech face.
boss was.
And during the firing process, this cartridge case slams into the breech face, and it can
Because
pick up an impression.
This evidence
of
is more, I
imperfections
think,
on that
centered.
surface.
It's going to be more
So you may
damaging
see
for,
some
say, Alec
parallel
Baldwin, who
lines.
was handling the weapon.
Some of these lines are kind of arcing. They almost appear to be crosshatch. Again, there's more parallel lines on the left here. That's an impression that this cartridge case has picked up from the breech face of the firearm.
Did you compare this casing with anything else, any other casings?
This was the only fired cartridge case that was submitted, but I did compare it to those known specimens that I collected from the
Yeah, because
revolver
he's the
was
one that
submitted.
handled the gun.
And the known specimens.
So I think what's more
Are
damaging
those
to
the ones
her,
that you
because
fired out of
she's
the revolver
charged
yourself?
under
That's correct. That's the secondary
theory
evidence that I
of
spoke about earlier.
basically
So I
a
created
failure
that
to act,
evidence
a
in the
failure
lab by
to
physically
occur,
test firing the
negligence in that
gun,
regard.
and they became my notes
And
at
then
that point.
the causal link for her
Did you
is,
form an
is
opinion about
she
whether
failed
or
to
not this
take safety protocols. She
cartridge
failed to
casing
separate
was
bullets.
fired from
As
the
a
gun
result,
that we saw in the earlier
Alec
exhibits?
Baldwin has the gun.
Yes, it's my opinion that
Mishandles
I
it.
identified this cartridge case as
him-
having been fired by the revolver.
It's going to
States
be
Exhibit 101.
shouldn't have
What
been
are we
live
looking at here?
rounds, but
So these
they're
are
proving that
representative
he had to
images
pull
of
that
the
trigger,
comparison
which
that I
is
did
reckless.
to get to that conclusion
And
of
we all know you
identification.
don't take a firearm,
So
load it
if
or
you look
unload it,
at the
and start
image
pulling the
on the
trigger
left,
in the direction of others.
This is two
If you
cartridge
do,
cases being
could
compared
be
side by side, and this is
thought
on
that
my
you
what's
would,
called comparison microscope.
potentially
So at the
cause death to
laboratory, I have
someone
this
or
microscope.
hurt someone.
I can mount two specimens.
Hence, the
There are two
theory they
separate
need to
microscopes
establish and the
connected
proof
by
they
an
need to
optical
establish
bridge,
to
and there's a
convict him of
binocular
involuntary
eyepiece at the
manslaughter.
top. So when I look through that binocular eyepiece, I can see images of both specimens side by side. So in the left image, there's this black line running down the center. That's what separates the two cartridge cases. So on the left side, you can see my notes at the bottom here, F item 2, that's my annotation for that came from item 2, which is the revolver. So those are my knowns.
But I think
On the
they're
right side is
also
item
wanting
3,
to
so that's the
suggest
cartridge case
that,
that was
as the
submitted.
armorer, she would have
And
been
in the photo on the
responsible
left, I'm
for
comparing those
ensuring
breech face
people
marks that I spoke about earlier. So the impression of that flat
properly
surface.
handling firearms.
I'm looking at the parallel lines
Hence
as
why
well
they're
as the
putting this
crosshatch
testimony
lines.
forth that
And the image on the
it would have
right,
required him to
I'm
pull
looking
the
at the features
trigger,
down within the firing pin impression.
not handle it correctly.
Thank you. States Exhibit 102. What's this?
These are 4 cartridges that were submitted for examination.
And when they were submitted to you for examination, were you given information about where they came from?
Yes, I do have that information that's been populated into the database.
And if you would tell us, just so that we know what your understanding was, just going to state of mind.
Right. It appears 3 of these were taken from the top of a cart, and the 4th was located in a holster inside of building. Those are the descriptions that I have.
Did you conduct any testing on these cartridges?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that.
So the process that I spoke about earlier, first I just examined the physical characteristics of these cartridges. I then x-rayed them to see if I could learn anything more about the inside. And then the last step was to actually disassemble these cartridges.
And after going through all of that, did you form an opinion about whether these cartridges were dummies or live?
So these cartridges contain the 4 components that are required to be live functional ammunition. So that being the cartridge case, the bullet. In the bottom here is the primer, which you see in the center of the photograph on the right. And inside the cartridge case is going to be powder, which is the propellant. So these 4 cartridges had all 4 of those main components, which are consistent with being live ammunition.
Is there writing on the head stamp of that bullet? Or the cartridge, rather?
Yes, it's the head stamp of the cartridge. Again, so this is the bottom of the cartridge. It has the caliber, and these kind of flower type logos with a line indicate the manufacturer of the cartridge case.
And did all of these cartridges have that same indication on the head stamp?
Yes.
Did all of the cartridges have the same color primer?
Yes.
Did all of the cartridges have the same shape projectile?
Yes, so you can see in the image on the left the shape of the bullet here, as well as the color, the finish of the bullet.
Hello, Bobo.
So these are what
Welcome.
are called lead flat-nose bullets.
State's Exhibit 103. What are we looking at here?
This is a photograph of essentially a box of ammunition that was submitted to the lab. So on the right-hand side, you see information that's present on the exterior of the box. And on the left-hand side is the foam tray that's inside that box, as well as the cartridges that were inside it.
When this photo was taken, if you can tell us, had the order of the cartridges in the styrofoam insert been modified?
Yes, so generally a box of ammunition comes in with 1 item number, and when I opened it up, I saw various things, various calibers, various types of bullets. So I started to form groups based on what was in that box, and then I gave them their own sub-item number. So for instance, I believe this was item 13, and I divided them based on the physical characteristics that I was seeing.
So the cartridges are in different positions in the
Hello,
styrofoam
Jeff.
insert in this photo than they may have been at the time they were taken into evidence.
That is possible. I'm not sure what positions they were in at the time it was opened.
And did you do any testing on these cartridges that were in this box?
Yes, I did the same series of testing that I've explained before.
And can you summarize for us what was in this box based on your examination and testing?
May I check my notes? Just
Certainly.
double check. So the vast majority of the cartridges that were in this box were dummy cartridges. And some of them had visual indicators. As I mentioned before, they may have a hole drilled in the side, or you could shake them, and again, that's an audible indicator. However, there was 1 cartridge in this box that, again, it had the 4 components required to be live ammunition.
And when you're looking at this photo, can you identify the cartridge that you believe was determined to be live?
I believe it was this one here with the silver primer.
Thank you. State's Exhibit 104. What's this?
This is actually 2 additional images of that cartridge that I just pointed out on the screen. So this is a side view of the cartridge on the left and an image of the head stamp region on the right.
I want to talk to you about the characteristics of this cartridge compared to the 4 live cartridges that we saw earlier. Does this cartridge have the same shape, projectile, or bullet as the other 4?
Yes, it does.
Does it have the same indication on the head stamp?
Yes,
And does it have the same color primer?
it does.
State's Exhibit 105. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
These are images of additional ammunition that was submitted for examination.
I agree,
And
Dolores.
These
That's the
some of
crux
the
of the
ammunition
case
came in
against
being
her.
declared
But what she's going to
as
try to
live
say is
ammunition.
because she
So
had
these are images of some of those
responsibilities that
cartridges that were submitted.
somehow
So these are all
that makes
live.
her not
They were described
technically
as being
responsible.
live, and they had
But
the physical characteristics of
as
being
we
live.
saw earlier last week,
Based on the information that
the
you
state's
received
proving that she actually
that
brought
went along with these
the
cartridges,
live rounds onto the
where
set
did,
from a
where
prior
did these
set she was
cartridges come
on.
from?
And that's what the
May I-
significance.
Go ahead.
You have some interesting ideas there, Bogo.
These cartridges are described as having been, or excuse me, as having come from Seth Kenny.
And do these cartridges, are they different than the live rounds, the 5 live rounds that we've seen photos of previously?
There are some differences, yes.
What are those?
So I see differences in the morphology of the bullet, so the shape of the bullet. For instance, this first one in the top left, this is actually a nickel-plated hollow point bullet, so it's not the lead flat nose that you previously saw. The images below that, these bullet types are semi-wad cutters. So again, it's just a different design of bullet, so it's different in shape than the ones you previously saw. You also see additional head stamps here, such as Winchester, GFL, which is a trade name called Fiocchi, and as well as CBC, which is made by Magtech. And this, due to the glare, it's a little difficult to see in this photo, but I also believe there's differences in the colors of the primers.
And let me ask you, if you were to go to a gun store and buy a box of ammunition, would the ammunition in that box have different shaped projectiles?
No, if I was buying a brand new box of ammunition, you go to Walmart, it's going to say on the outside what those bullet designs are. For example, it may say jacketed hollow point, it may say round nose, it may say truncated cone. So I would expect if I open that brand new box of ammunition, all of the bullet morphologies would be the same.
Thank you. State's Exhibit 106. What's this?
This is another series of photographs of another ammunition box that was scented. So in the top left, you see the exterior of the box. Bottom left, you see that foam insert
another
as well as
CG.
the cartridges. And then the image of the right, on the right, is just those cartridges being removed from the tray.
Can you tell us where these came from, at least what the description was that was provided to you?
Do you have an item number for this by chance?
I will get you one. $28.
Okay. Item 28 was described as having come from the item 27 tray, which is the tray you see here, which was described as having come from the 26 box. And the 26 box was described as coming from 126 Monroe Street.
It is true, judges do, I think, over.
In your examination of these cartridges,
And they are not.
were you
God,
able to
but
make a
in
determination
their
about whether they
court,
were live or
and to
dummies?
some people, with the impact they have on their lives,
Mayor
certainly,
versus-
Sure.
certainly have a godlike impact.
Okay, so these cartridges were submitted being declared as being live cartridges. So basically they were submitted and it was understood that these were live functioning ammunition. So I did disassemble 2 of these just to essentially verify that. And the 2 that I disassembled, again, it had the 4 main components that are required to be live functioning ammunition. So the ones that I didn't, they were described as being live, but the 2 that I did had all 4 components required.
Are there any differences in the characteristics of these live cartridges compared to the live cartridges that came from the set of the movie Rust?
Yeah, so again, in the bottom left, I see differences in primer color. These are brass as opposed to nickel. I can't read the head stamps in this photograph.
Well, that BOGO, I
but
have
as
to
far as the
disagree with
bullets
you.
go, these
There
are also
are
different
areas we
because
can
we have
improve, but
the ones that
the
have
American
this
system is one of
sort of little
one of
lip
the most unique
above the mouth.
in the world, in the sense that
Yeah.
Sorry.
the presumption of innocence
Those
that
are
we
called
provide
semi-wad cutters.
every defendant.
And the other ones, which
is
you
what
see
makes
do
it
not
special.
have that lip,
Now,
these are called truncated cone.
there's
So the
there's
ones
plenty of
that you previously saw, these are
forces
different
and
from
people
flat
that
nose
try
because
to
they don't have the rounded sides. It just goes straight.
take that away.
If you were to picture
and
like an orange construction
would love
cone,
to
it
take
just
that
goes
away.
straight up to the
But
tip.
the American system is actually really a very unique
States Exhibit 107.
way
What's
of doing
this?
things, and it offers a lot of protections.
Well, and let's begin with
that,
what your understanding was
others don't.
of where they came
and
from.
until you get ensnared in a system in another country, you know, it's something that's really underappreciated.
Again, these were reported as coming from 126 Monroe Street.
Were they provided to you with the understanding that they were presumed live or dummy? What was?
Yes, these were presumed live.
And do you have an opinion about whether or not they are actually live cartridges?
So in this case, I did not disassemble any of these, so I can't speak about what's inside the cartridge. So for instance, does it actually have an active primer? Does it have the propellant?
Oh, I agree.
So since I
mean,
didn't
like
disassemble
I said,
these,
the
I can't
video
specify
they
that I
showed
know what's on the
moments
inside.
after,
But again, these
to
were
me,
described as
and
being
then
live.
you work
And
backwards from
the
that, and she's apologizing, and saying,
characteristics
"Oh my God, I'm
of
so
these
sorry."
cartridges, did you
She
find
knew,
them to
there
be
were
consistent
issues.
with
She
live
knew
ammunition?
she wasn't doing her job.
Based on my
And-
physical observations of the exterior, yes.
You know,
And
it's not good
are
for her.
there differences in the characteristics between these cartridges and the 5 cartridges that were provided to you from the set of the movie Rust?
Yes, it's the same types of differences that we've been discussing. So I see differences in the head stamp, which indicates a different manufacturer, as well as the bullet morphology appears different.
States Exhibit 108, what's this?
These are additional cartridges submitted, and again, these were submitted being declared as live cartridges.
And did they appear to be consistent with live cartridges?
Two of these I did disassemble, so I could verify that they had the 4 components of live cartridges. The rest I did not. So they were physically consistent with being live, but again, I don't have an understanding of what's occurring inside the cartridge.
And same question, do these cartridges have different characteristics than the live rounds provided from the set of the movie Rust?
Yes, they do. And it's the same. Various head stamps, various primer colors, various bullet morphologies.
States Exhibit 109. Have you seen this before?
Yes.
Is States Exhibit 109 from your notes?
Yes, it is.
Just tell us what we're looking at.
So, as part of my examination of the ammunition, I worked with the contributor to figure out which items they wanted disassembled. So I made this chart in my notes. So this shows the images of the cartridges prior to disassembly. The middle column explains the original item number as well as what the item number that I was going to create in order to disassemble a cartridge. And then the last column is just a description of essentially what's left. So for instance, the third row across, item 28 originally was all of those cartridges, but I removed 2, so I sub-itemized 28-1 and 28-2. And then the third column tells you that what's left of 28 is 7 remaining cartridges, and the 2 that I subdivided are eventually what we're going to be disassembled.
And if you already testified to it, I apologize. Did you disassemble all of the live rounds from the set of the movie Rust?
All of the rounds that had the physical characteristics of being live, yes, I disassembled those because I wanted to know if they did or did not have the components on the inside.
Did you take a photograph of the gunpowder that came out of those disassembled rounds from the set of the movie?
Yes, I did.
And did you also take a photograph of the gunpowder that came out of the live cartridges that came from other sources? I think you mentioned Mr. Kenny and also 126 Monroe Street. Did you photograph that powder?
Yes, I did.
And without even using a microscope, did you see differences?
Yes, there were clear differences in both the shapes of the powders as well as the color, which means they may have some different types of coatings on the powder.
Let's move to State's Exhibit 110. Tell us what we're looking at here.
So on the left side, you're looking at a photograph of the powder that was taken from the item 4 cartridge. So this was one that was submitted that was presumed to be live based on its exterior appearance. But once I took it apart, this is the actual powder that I pulled from the inside of that cartridge. And on the right, you're looking at the same thing, but this is from item 24-1, which is one of the cartridges that was submitted as being known to be a live cartridge.
And the powder, I understand on the left we're looking at powder from item 4. Were you able to see the powder from item 5, 6, 7, and 13-1?
Yes, they were all consistent, which is why I only included one photograph, because it would be 5 photographs of the same thing.
Thank you. And I'm going to use briefly a demonstrative aid.
Counsel, we're going to take our morning bathroom break.
Sure.
Please don't talk among yourselves or anyone else about the evidence received here in court.
All rise for the jury.
All right, you may be seated. Counsel, approach.
All right, so sorry about that. I had to step away for a brief minute, but looks like we are on a break. So what I'm going to do is let's see here. And I see everybody is thinking guilty. Remember, we have to give her a presumption of innocence, so we don't want to jump too soon. One of the reasons why judges say don't form conclusions is because when you start to form a conclusion early, instead of you giving the evidence due consideration, you start thinking of things to defend your position. So that's one of the reasons why judges will give that instruction, because it's very important that you don't prejudge something or don't come to a conclusion, because then you have a tendency to want to defend that in your mind, and you start looking for things to prove your conclusion, as opposed to just looking at the evidence and letting it help you come to your own conclusion. Um, but all right, so what we're going to do while we're on break, and I'll continue to monitor to see when this trial comes back, we're going to watch the Paul Ferguson sentencing hearing that just happened earlier this morning. That'll be kind of something we can do here to keep us entertained while we're waiting for court to resume. So let me switch and share that tab over here. Give me a moment. Or maybe it's not going to give me that option. So maybe I'll have to manually do it here. All right, Paul Ferguson. All right. So we're jump back in here on that.
All rise. Come to order. 14th Circuit Court, County Muskegon is now in session. The Honorable Matthew R. Casel is presiding. And you may be seated.
Before the court is file 22-3537 FC. It's people of the state of Michigan versus Paul Ferguson. Are you Paul Ferguson, sir?
Yes,
Take the
sir.
answer verbally.
Yes,
Are you
sir.
Paul Ferguson?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Ferguson appears before the court with his attorney, Mr. Joshua Eldon Brady. The people are represented by Mr. Matthew Roberts. Date time is scheduled for a sentencing in this case. Have the people had a chance to review the pre-sentence report and the attached guidelines?
We have, Your Honor, we have no corrections to that, although I know the court is in receipt of a letter this morning, as we all are, from Paul's older brother. We have no objection to that being included in the report as well.
Is there any objection to? I did receive a letter from Nolan Ferguson, who was here in present for Shonda Van Aar's sentencing, and I did receive that this morning. I didn't have a chance to read that before I came on the bench. Do you have a copy as well, Mr.
I have a copy, yes, Your Honor, and I have no objection to that either.
Okay. Also, the court is in receipt of two assessments, psychological assessments. One is from a Thomas D. Shazer, psychiatrist, forensic psychologist for Ann Arbor. It's 25 pages in length. That was submitted by defense counsel at the urging, I will say, of the court. asking for that, so I appreciate that, Mr. Alvin Brady. I also am in receipt of a report from Sami Farhat, a PhD, licensed psychologist. This is a 7-page report. It's a psychological assessment as well. It was also provided by defense counsel. Court has reviewed those in anticipation of sentencing. Mr. Roberts, have you received a copy of those?
Yes, I have.
And Mr. Alvin Brady, and any objection to the court reviewing those and considering those as sentencing Mr. Roberts?
No, Your
Mr. Alvin Brady?
No objection, but I would ask those be considered as non-public exhibits.
Yeah, the court is going to have them scanned into the court file, but they are going to be non-public. They do contain a large amount of what I would consider very personal medical information that I don't think is appropriate to be in the public domain. The court is going to reference certain conclusory conclusions from these reports, but those do not reveal specific medical information. I think it's appropriate, so the court will make these part of the record because it's going to be consider those in sentencing, but again, it's going to be non-public. So, all right. Any additions or corrections you have to the pre-sentence report, Mr. Roberts?
On that addition, no, I have none.
Okay, Mr. Alvin Brady, have you had an opportunity to review the pre-sentence report and the attached guidelines?
Yes, I have no additions or corrections. I would also note, as we're on the topic of letters, I submitted a letter from Stephen and Martha Vander Ark. Those are Mr. Ferguson's, I believe those would be step-grandparents, the current placement of his younger half-brother, G. They had intended to be here in support this morning, but were ill this weekend.
Okay, yeah, I have also considered that too. Did you receive a copy of that as well, Mr. Roberts?
I did.
Okay, I've read that too. I've gotten a large number of letters from people that I would say unrelated to this case specifically, just individuals who saw it on court TV and expressing an opinion. I am not considering those in sentencing because, one, they're not directly connected to the case. And I do appreciate the comments from individuals, but I think it's important we limit the record to people who actually have something to do with this case or connected with the victim. So unless there's an objection to that, I've read them, but I'm not using it as a consideration. So any objection to that, Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Alvin Brady?
I would note, not having seen copies of those, I can't comment on the specific letter, but no issue with that, Your Honor.
Yeah, I mean, there's just random people who saw it on TV, and I just don't think it's appropriate for the court to take that into consideration for sentencing purposes. I don't think that's fair to Mr. Ferguson. So, anyway. So no additions or corrections, Mr. Alvin Brady?
No additions or corrections.
All right, and Mr. Ferguson, have you received a copy of the pre-sentence report and the attached guidelines?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any additions or corrections you have?
No, Your Honor.
And have you had any ample opportunity to discuss the contents of that report with your attorney?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Roberts, do we have any victim representative who wishes to make a statement today?
We do not, Your Honor.
Okay. Any comments regarding sentencing?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. As I've said to the court before, this is, as it relates to Paul, this is one of the most difficult cases I think I've ever had to deal with, not just from the standpoint of how difficult the subject matter was here, the tragic death of Timothy and the circumstances surrounding it, but just with Paul himself, and I'm not saying anything today, but really this, I haven't told Paul.
Yeah, the sentence would be similar for Alec Baldwin. He faces up to 3 years. Basically, that's the maximum for involuntary manslaughter in New Mexico. Like I mentioned, in my state of West Virginia, that's 12 months is the maximum you get for that. There's a lot of states out there, it's a misdemeanor. This is actually what she's charged with is a class 4 felony. So that makes it interesting. And what we're watching here, this is the Shanda Van Ark's son. He testified against her. I don't know if, for those of you who aren't familiar with that case, she was charged with child abuse and essentially starving her son to death. And he assisted, Paul was her son, he was the older brother who assisted her in all of that. And I'm not sure what he was expecting as far as sentence-wise, but it was basically that the state would not request an outside of guideline sentence, whatever that means. I know in Michigan he's facing up to life right now.
What is absolutely clear from both of these assessments is that whatever upbringing Paul had from his mother and frankly from his father as well led to him being how he is today. And that was a childhood that I think both reports indicate was marked with abuse and neglect, a very traumatic upbringing, moved around a lot, and what also rings through in these assessments is that nobody did anything to get Paul any help when it could have made a difference. So that is in some respects that's the good part of this, because it does seek to at least explain in some regard why Paul behaved the way that he did. But there's bad in here as well, and I'm sure the court will note this, but the one sentence that struck me in Dr. Shaser's report is that it says, in my opinion, Paul Ferguson was predisposed to abuse his brother independent of his mother's presence and active influence in his life. That's frankly scary. And there's other scary parts of this as well that indicate that Paul was, at least in some respect, predisposed to being essentially a bully. And that's how you could view his behavior, is that he was a bully. Now, nobody, I think, would expect any bully to take it to the extreme of actually killing a person, although certainly it does happen, but nobody would expect that was an intentional outcome that Paul sought here. And we can't lose sight of the fact that Paul didn't become this way in a vacuum, that his upbringing in some respects led to him being predisposed, as this report indicates, and I think the other report references it as well, that he was predisposed to already doing some of these things. Frankly, I think that Ms. Vander Ark took advantage of that and used Paul because she saw an opportunity to have Paul do the horrible things that she couldn't do herself or wouldn't do herself, but be done at her direction. And Paul was unfortunately willing to go along with those things because of everything that had happened to him, because of his traumatic upbringing, and because of the conditions that he did have that led to that. So it's hard to balance these things out. Certainly we did not have this report at the time that Paul pled, and I don't know that in looking at this report that the decision that was made in this case would be any different. But certainly there are things here that would have been nice to have been able to consider, but we didn't have the benefit of that. And as I told the court, I think I've told the court on several occasions in speaking to the jury, they were, in Ms. Vander Ark's case, very much impressed by, might not be the right word, but certainly factored in Paul's testimony a great deal. Believed that he was telling the truth, believed that he was honest about what his role in this and Ms. Vander Ark's role in this. So I think his testimony was instrumental in achieving the conviction that was achieved here against Ms. Vander Ark. So I certainly owe Paul that consideration. But beyond that, I certainly don't envy the position the court is in today. In balancing everything that has taken place here, the good and the bad, even in this report, and the good and the bad with Paul, I will stick to the agreement that we have made here. I will ask the court to sentence within the sentencing guidelines in this case. Certainly the court is obviously free to exceed the guidelines if it feels there's a basis to do so, and quite frankly, there are reasons to exceed the guidelines. In some respects, there's reasons to go below the guidelines as well. So literally, I think any number that the court chooses to pick here, I think would be the appropriate sentence, because I think it's a difficult balancing act that the court has to do here. But my commitment was and continues to be that we would ask the court to sentence within the sentencing guidelines. I would ask the court, however, to impose a maximum number.
She was actually already sentenced, actually. If you go on my channel, I can drop a link to it. I have the sentencing hearing on here. I covered it, well, sort of covered it. I aired it. But yeah, she was sentenced.
Potential antisocial disorder, the essential
already,
sociopath. If those things are borne
in her
out
case.
In the prison system,
but that's a terrible case.
Then has the opportunity to keep
but she and her co-defendant were each given
I hope that he can get some treatment inside there. But the bad
similar sentence.
To be addressed, and if it's not, then
and in that state, the Department of Corrections has a lot of leeway on how much of the sentence she actually does or doesn't do.
In the moment, did not appear that Paul felt bad about those things. There certainly was a moment where he thought he needed to let his mother know that Timothy was very thin and that they should start feeding him. But overall, what comes through in these reports is that for the most part, those were absent. And the text messages, I think, even bear that out as well. That even after that noting of the fact that Timothy was very thin and that they needed to start feeding him, Paul was still a willing participant in the truly tragic and horrible things that happened in the last days of Timothy's life, including the prolonged ice bath that Paul watched over. So certainly that ban needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, she basically got sentenced
so again,
to.
I don't envy the position the court is in today. I will stick with my commitment here and ask the court to sentence within the sentencing guidelines. But
Basically,
frankly, any number that the court
4
picks here,
years,
I think would be an appropriate sentence
to,
for Mr. Ferguson.
60
I'm
years,
pleased
or
that we've
4.
been able to
She got sentenced to
achieve whatever
4
justice we
sentences
can
of
for
1 to
Timothy
15
here.
years.
In
So
both
she's
of these
facing
convictions,
a
and
minimum of
certainly the
4
two people
years,
most
up to
directly
60
responsible
years,
for what happened to
and she has to
Timothy
serve
are
it
going to
consecutive
be
on
in all
each
likelihood be
count.
incarcerated for an extended
So
period of time, certainly in Ms. Van Dyke's
essentially,
case for the rest
she's
of
got
her
to
life,
ask for
which is
parole
completely
on
justified
each
under
one of
these
those charges.
circumstances. So I would ask the court
And
to, as
then,
it will have to do, to weigh the good
and that's
and the
why
bad in these reports.
the Department of
I
Corrections
trust
is
the
going to have a
court's,
huge amount of leeway.
I trust whatever
They
decision
say
the
the
court makes.
maximum that she'll
All right.
serve is about 30 years maximum,
Your Honor,
because
I'd like to
they
start by
kill
responding to a point that Mr. Robert made.
they
before
kill the
going
sentences
to
in that state at 50% for good behavior.
the multiple points I plan to address. I understand the prosecutor's characterization of Paul as being the enforcer, as being the primary one. But I believe part of that is based simply on the evidence that we have. This court's heard the text messages, extensive text messages, of Ms. Vander Ark instructing Paul on what he was to do to Timothy. We've heard Paul's testimony about what he was instructed to do and what he did. The rest of the time, when she was there doing whatever she did, Paul was at work. She didn't have to send text messages to herself. Timothy's not here to talk about what happened when it was just him and his mother. So I disagree with that characterization. I believe, based on what we do know of Ms. Vander Ark, that there was far, far more that went on. There was far, far more that she did that there simply is no evidence of, no one to speak of, because the only person alive who knows what she did is her. Beyond that, reading the pre-sentence report in this case, I can't argue with the reasonableness of the recommendations in the pre-sentence report. I also really can't add anything about the offense, about the details of what happened to Timothy. You presided over the same trial that I watched. I know in motions, other paperwork submitted to the court, you're aware of far, far more than what came out publicly, what was submitted to the jury. But I'd ask the court to consider, I think there's 5 fronts on which Paul should be evaluated very differently.
Well, it's not that they have a governing body. It's the and this is true. Like my state does the same thing. There are certain offenses where instead of giving it what they call a determinate sentence, in other words, instead of sentencing, they did it here. Instead of sentencing them to a fixed term, they sentence them to a range. So it basically says you're going to serve a minimum, and then there's a maximum.
Say I think that's right or that's
and
wrong.
then the
Department
of Corrections gets to evaluate, and I kind of like that better than giving it a determinate sentence, because it basically says that the Department of Corrections can come in,
who would have been an attorney,
evaluate you,
academically was qualified to
and
be an attorney,
tailor your sentence to your situation and what you do in your behind bars. Do you go in there,
both from a
act
legal
up,
front, from
not
a
follow
moral
the
front,
rules,
from
not
an
try to better
intellectual
yourself?
front,
If you do,
had
then
far,
you can get
far
out.
more capacity to understand what she was
You know,
doing,
in her case, a
and
minimum
the
of 4
potential
years.
consequences of what
If
she was doing.
they find that she's,
Than her son, who is a
you know,
20-year-old
a danger to society, they could keep her in there up to, well, the maximum is 60, but
there's simply no comparison
in that state,
incapacity
don't
and life
you don't
experience
serve
and
more
an
than
ability to
50% of whatever that
understand and
maximum is.
recognize what was
So
happening.
she would be eligible then to be released in 30 years.
Second, will we recognize for purposes
But
of
that link there
the child
is
abuse statute, for purposes of Paul's plea,
to my
the
videos
law may
covering
not
her sentencing.
distinguish
If you want to
between
watch
a
that, check
parent
it out.
and another person over the age of 18 who's placed in charge of a child. We all know a mother has a very different role than a sibling. We all know that there's a certain level of rivalry, a certain level of competition that we expect between siblings, which is very different than the care that we expect from parents. Third,
Yeah,
we'll
it's
come back to
basically,
the
I mean,
text
it's
messages.
essentially
very clear
parole board.
Paul was a follower
But yes,
of
in a
his mother's
determinate
behavior.
sentence, she'll be eligible to go before the parole
Listening
board in a
to
year.
over an
They
hour
will
of text
assess her at
messages
that
read during
time.
her trial.
They will get
There's
feedback
pieces
from,
missing.
you know,
You
her
don't get the
counselor
whole
at the
story.
prison,
She talked to
how
him
she's
on the camera,
staying, and then at that point,
she talked to him on the
they will then
phone,
make a
she talked to him in
recommendation either
person.
to grant her
But what is
parole
very clear from
or
those text
say, okay,
messages
these are the
is
things
there is
that
not a single time
you
that
need to work
Paul
on,
gives an
and
instruction.
they'll determine whether she can ask again in a
Every
year,
single
2
time an
years, 3
instruction is
years.
given, you need to do this.
And then in that amount of time,
It is
she'll
given
essentially
by
be
her.
given a whole list of things to work on if they don't grant her parole at that time.
Fourth, and
To
Mr.
which
Roberts
she can then come
addressed
back and
this
make a
regarding
request
Paul's
of
cooperation.
the of them again in
Once
that period of
the
time.
gravity of
So for
what
her,
happened sank in,
she'll be coming
I
up. She'll
believe
have
from
to
the
ask for
reports that was
parole
a
on
very
sentence
short
1,
after.
then 2, then 3, then the fourth
Paul has
sentence
shown
will be the one that
remorse.
would be able to eventually get
He's
her
shown
released.
confusion over how he
So,
could have done this,
and they
and
basically, the judge
recognition that
basically
he
said
was
she has to
wrong.
serve 4 consecutive sentences. Now she's
He's
going to appeal
testified
that
honestly.
because
He's
there
fully cooperated
is,
in many areas in
you know,
ways that
a
were
thought that
not of
says
clear
if
benefit
all of
to
these
him.
were out of one set of
His
circumstances
mother
or
did
acts,
none of these things.
then she should have been
She
sentenced
took the stand and
what they call
lied,
concurrent. So
redirected.
it would have been
It's
4
not my
sentences
fault.
of 1 to
I
15.
didn't do
But when
anything
you're
wrong.
serving the first sentence, you're getting credit for serving all 4
And
of them,
fifth, and
meaning she would have gotten out or
I
would be
think
eligible to get
very
out in 1 year
important in looking
no
at
more
the
than
evaluation
7.5 years.
of Mr. Ferguson.
But the judge went ahead and
It's very clear
stacked
that
them on
he
top
and
of
his
each
other
other.
siblings were also victims of their mother. CPS involvement, going back to when they were in elementary school, back when Timothy was 18 months old. A third grade teacher who said Paul and Nolan are secretive about what happens at home. They're not supposed to talk about it.
No
So
problem.
Mr. Johnson argued in cross-examination to Paul, why didn't you report it to somebody? A lifetime of being told you're not supposed to talk about what goes on at home. A lifetime of being isolated, separated from peers, having no meaningful social contacts outside his household. That all started with her. A record that when Timothy was 18 months old, when Paul was 7, that Timothy was underfed, failure to thrive. Paul didn't have anything to do with that. He was 7. But that was the pattern. That was his entire life. That was his entire framework. That was what she taught him from the beginning, or at times failed to teach him through neglect. Mr. Roberts referenced, and I don't remember if it was in sentencing or in his closing argument, that the difference between Timothy and Paul was that Paul was useful. Timothy wasn't. At least not to their mother. And I wouldn't disagree with that characterization. But I think that's important for the court to consider. Timothy was treated the way he was because he wasn't useful. That's how children in their mother's household were treated if they weren't useful. And I believe at some level, some part of Paul understood that. He understood that we do these things to Timothy because he misbehaves, because he doesn't follow instruction, and because he's not useful. And part of understanding that is also understanding that if he didn't follow instructions, if he misbehaved, if he got on her bad side, that he could once again be subject to some of the same mistreatment. On the neglect front, I don't think any of them ever ceased to be subject to that mistreatment. And I'll end with his mother's own words from the text messages read in court. To Paul, quote, if he falls asleep for you, from you, not watching, that is not going to end well for either of you. Thank you.
Your Honor, if I could just make one more brief point, and it's not in response to anything that Mr. Eldenbrady has said, but the court referenced that it's had a lot of outside people contacting the court. I certainly have had that as well. And one of the consistent themes there is people believing that Paul suffers, or not suffers, it's not a suffering, that Paul is on the autism spectrum. I think it's important to note that in both of these evaluations, that's not borne out. Certainly people may have that belief and think that should be a factor here, but there's nothing in either one of these reports that supports that conclusion. So I just want to note that. That is certainly something that I think the court could have considered, but there's nothing in the report that would support that, and I don't think Mr. Eldenbrady would disagree with that point.
Yeah. I was going to reference that in my comments as well. So,
Your Honor, I think the reports do bear out that some of the characteristics that those individuals are observing and coming to that conclusion are connected to that neglect and abuse, and I believe it was Dr. Farrat characterized as normalization of abnormal behavior. So while I agree that both analysis seem to have come to the conclusion that diagnosis is inappropriate, I don't believe that those observations by the individuals mentioning that are ungrounded. It's simply that those behavioral characteristics come from a different source and therefore do not lead to the ability to officially diagnose with that condition. That does not change the fact that those characteristics are there, that those characteristics are relevant to Paul's interactions with his mother, or that those characteristics are relevant to ongoing treatment services that Paul will need moving forward.
okay. Mr. Ferguson, anything you wish to say prior to sentencing?
Yes, Your Honor. What reasons could justify my actions? I could make up 1,000 and never believe one. What words could voice my regrets? I can think of millions, yet never feel it's enough. If I could do it all again and do it right, I would. I feel I will pay for my choices and yet never feel better, because he's still gone. I have had time to think during my time in Muskegon County Jail, and I've realized many things about myself that I might never have considered otherwise. My problems and flaws, to put it simply, are the place to begin correction of self. I asked the judge for nothing more than mercy and fairness, to offer me compassion so I might learn from him. I only hope to better myself in the coming days and serve my time with what little honor I have left, and to make right my faults in search of a better tomorrow.
First and foremost, as Mr. Roberts referenced, the court is was in a difficult position. This particular case, I think a lot of individuals saw Mr. Ferguson testify, and I think there was concerns about intellectual potential disabilities, and the court was concerned with that as well. There was also a concern whether Mr. Ferguson was the target of manipulation on behalf of his mother, and the reports that were submitted to the court really did.
All right, so it looks like we're back here on this, guys. I apologize we interrupted the sentencing. We'll go back at the next break. Finish watching that as we were getting to the good part where the judge was going to be speaking. Here we are.
Mr. Ziegler, I just have a couple of final questions for you. Can you see these demonstrative aids that I've put side by side on the screen?
Yes.
And can you see the writing at the bottom, the typing?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So the image on the left, is that an exhibit that we've already looked at?
Yes, we've previously seen this photograph.
And same thing with the image on the right. Is that an exhibit we've already looked at?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, there's that writing that was out of the frame. So I'm going to scroll up here. Is this an exhibit that we've already looked at?
Yes.
Item 13-1, did that come from the set of the movie Rust?
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. 13-1, did that come from the box that was provided to you?
Yes.
The box of ammunition that we saw earlier?
Yes, this was the box where the majority of the cartridges were in fact dummy cartridges, but this was the one that had the characteristics of being live.
And just comparing the ammunition on the left and the ammunition on the right, can you see distinguishing characteristics, understanding that you cannot see the head stamp or the primer?
Yes, so as we've previously discussed, the bullets are a different shape.
And I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 2, or I'm sorry, 102 on the left, and those are items 4 through 7. Where did items 4 through 7 come from in terms of the description you received?
Those were the ones that I previously mentioned were from the top of a cart, and with item 7 being found in a holster inside a building.
Do these cartridges that we're looking at on the left and the right, do they appear to have the same shape projectile?
Yes, they do.
All right. Thank you. I'll pass the witness.
Cross-examine.
Sir, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Mr. Ziegler, I want to start with your training with the FBI. As part of that training, were you trained in recognizing dummy rounds?
There were many portions of the training manual dedicated to ammunition, ammunition components. I can't recall if there is a specific task related to dummy ammunition.
And by answering that way, it sounds to me like you were not trained on the recognition and characteristics of various types of dummy rounds, correct?
I don't necessarily agree with that.
Well, do you remember any modules that you were trained on dummy rounds or not?
Not specific, no.
Okay. So you wouldn't know what a Denix round is, would you?
I do not.
Okay. And you wouldn't know a Denix round is from Spain and it doesn't shake and it's a dummy round? You're not aware of that?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Now, also with respect to your training, you were trained in gun safety, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as an FBI agent, you're trained in gun safety, including don't point a weapon at anybody?
I'm not an agent, but because I fire as part of my job, I have been trained in safety precautions, yes.
Okay, sir, and as part of your test firing protocols, I'm sure you observe all those safety. Not to point a gun at anybody, treat it as loaded, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. You observe all those?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And sir, you indicated one of your opinions was that your first testing, you determined this gun functioned normally.
That's correct.
Okay. When you were doing that functionality test on the revolver you received, what types of things did you look at on the firearm?
So first I would inspect things like, are there bulges in the barrel, cracks in the frame, things that I may think may lead to a catastrophic failure during the testing.
Okay, sir, do you take that revolver apart in the initial stage?
I do not.
So later on, and I'll come back to this, but you indicated when you hit that hammer with your mallet that it fractured some internal components, correct?
Correct.
And there was the sear, we saw a little piece of the trigger. You remember, sir?
Yes.
Now, because you did not open the revolver prior to doing that hammer test, can you be certain any of those pieces weren't broken before?
I would say I can't be 100% certain. However, because it did function normally, I would expect those pieces were intact at the time I received it and did that initial examination.
Okay, and when you visually examined it from the outside, you then test fired that weapon 12 times, is that right?
As it was 12 times throughout the process, but yes.
And you observed when you did that it had to be fully cocked and that trigger had to be depressed to fire it, correct?
Aside from the hammer being at rest and being struck on a loaded chamber.
Correct. And other than those tests you did, I'm talking about the first part, it fired normally.
Correct.
Okay. Now, after you did that normal gun functionality testing, you determine its functioning, you then do what's called accidental discharge testing, is that right?
That was after the microscopic comparisons were done, so that was the last test that I did.
Okay, so you do the functionality, then you do the microscopic examination we saw, and then you do the accidental discharge.
Correct.
Okay. Now, the accidental discharge, you mentioned that you consult the FBI SOP.
That's correct.
Now, an SOP is a standard operating procedure?
Yes, sir.
Now, under that standard operating procedure, were you to do a type of test called a drop test?
So the drop test is, I would say that's a subcategory of accidental discharge where I physically drop the firearm to see if it will fire. And that is typically only done if that is as the situation has been reported by the contributor. So that was not relevant in this case.
Okay, when you say, and a drop test, you can tell the jury more, that's when you, from a distance of about 4 feet, drop the weapon, and if it lands and it fires, that's what you're trying to determine, correct?
It depends on how the situation is being reported. So within that same SOP, it provides the examiner some discretion as in regards to how that is believed to occur. So for instance, say I'm cleaning my gun and I accidentally knock it off the table and I'm saying that caused it to fire. I would try to replicate that situation. If I had a gun leaning against a door and I'm saying that the door opened and the firearm fell, I would try to replicate that situation. So yes, the traditional drop test is just it being held as you would to shoot it and dropping it, but there is some discretion that's allowed if it is being reported in a certain way.
Okay, and you're familiar with SAMI standards, are you not?
Yes.
And SAMI is the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturing Institute, is that correct?
That is correct.
They were commissioned by the federal government about 100 years ago to come up with industry-type standards?
I don't know when they were instituted, but yes, they come up with standards for ammunition as far as dimensions and things like that.
1926. Were you aware of that?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. So in their SAMI standards, there is a standardized drop test. You're aware of that?
I'm not.
Okay, but that's the industry standard for firearms across the country. This type of testing, right? Multiple states use this?
I wouldn't say that's the industry standard, and also their industry is different from the forensic industry.
Okay, and you also know there's no type of shock test. Do you know what a shock test is?
In regards to what?
Well, it's kind of what you did with the mallet. Are you familiar with the National Institute of Justice? They call it a shock test.
I'm not familiar with that test.
Okay. So when you made your determination to hit that revolver with a mallet, is that part of the SOP that you hit it with a mallet?
That is written in the SOP, yes.
How many times have you done that as a forensic examiner? How many weapons you've done that on?
I would say probably less than 10, and this is the first one that I've had in actual casework.
Okay, so in actual casework, what do you mean by that?
As opposed to training.
Oh, in training. So the other 9 were done in training when you hit it with the mallet.
I don't know the exact number, but yes.
So this is literally the first time in your career as a forensic examiner that you've ever, in cases, hit a revolver with a hammer.
That is correct.
So is it fair to say you've never had this situation where you've hit a revolver and it's broken before?
Not in a case.
Okay. Did that happen in training?
I don't know about specifically being a revolver, but yes, I have done it in training where the firearms do break.
And you earlier told us that you base your discretion on that accidental discharge test on input given to you about what might have happened.
Not the accidental discharge test. That would be the drop test.
Drop test. So you didn't have any information this was hit with some kind of hammer on the rest set, correct?
That's correct. I did not.
Okay, but you chose to do this, and then you hit the weapon with the hammer resting in the resting position, right?
Yes.
And then you did in the full cock position, correct?
It was not in that order, but you are correct.
Okay, and I'm not trying to mix it up, but when you hit it with the full cock position, that's when you broke the internal components.
Yes.
Now, do you know how hard you hit that?
I do not.
So on a drop test, would you agree with me, you're trying to eliminate variables. So in other words, gravity is the same, right?
Sure.
Gravity's not going to change. So if you drop that gun from 4 feet every time, and you know the weight of that gun, you're eliminating variables, correct?
I suppose so.
Okay, well, have you been taught that at all? In the FBI?
No. The purpose of these tests is not to figure out exactly what height or exactly what amount of force or exactly how many numbers of times you have to strike this firearm to get it to fire. It's just to try to generally replicate the situations and see if the firearm will fire without pulling the trigger.
Well, sir, so did you ever measure the trigger pull force on that revolver?
I did.
You did?
Yes.
What was the trigger pull force?
May I refer to my notes?
Yes, sir.
Between 2 and 2.5 pounds.
2.5 pounds, okay. Did you measure the weight of that firearm?
The weight of the
revolver?
No.
Okay. So, and you have no idea the foot-pounds of pressure that you were applying to that hammer when you hit it with the mallet, correct?
Right. There's no way to quantify that.
And there's no way to quantify when you do that 6 times if you're hitting it the same amount every time, right?
That's correct.
As a human being, I mean, you're not going to hit it the exact same every time.
I believe that's true, yes.
Okay. So, as we sit here, we don't know what amount of force was required to break that hammer and the internal parts, correct?
That's correct. We do not.
Okay. So if there was a question whether or not an external force of some type hit that hammer, we don't know from your testing what amount of force that was that would cause that.
You are correct.
Okay. If you were you given any other information regarding the accidental discharge testing that you can recall?
Initially, that test was not requested. It was not part of the initial exam. The decision to do that test came in later conversations with the case agent.
Okay. So initially, they did not even ask you to do that, but it was sometime later they did.
Correct.
And did you have any understanding as to why you were going to do that?
I believe it had something to do with one of the individuals involved stating that the trigger was not pulled.
Was that Alec Baldwin?
I believe so.
And based on your testing on the functionality, that comment about the trigger not being pulled could not have happened.
I can't say it's impossible because I can't account for every single variable. All I can testify to is the results of my testing. Okay, so when I received the firearm and I did that initial function examination, it did not appear that any of the safeties were malfunctioning or anything like that. So it was functioning normally when I received it.
And to be fair, sir, you did indicate earlier you do this in a lab. So you can't account for all the variables that might occur on a movie set, for example.
Sure.
Okay. So your testimony, and you're telling the jury that you can account for the variables you're aware of, but you cannot account for variables you might not be aware of.
Sure.
Okay. And some of those variables, and we'll come to the rounds in a little bit, but some of those variables include if you do not receive evidence or a request to test it, you're not going to test that, obviously.
That's true.
Okay. With regard to the hammer testing, you mentioned earlier that this could be destroyed permanently as part of your testing. So you got permission to do this test, correct?
Yes.
And that would have been for the sheriffs?
Well, my point of contact was a special agent out of Albuquerque. So I would funnel information to him. He would discuss that with the detectives, and then they would distribute the answer back to me.
And that was Jose Cortez?
That's correct.
Okay. And Mr. Cortez is the one that sent you the request by submission, written submission, for what he wanted you to do, correct?
As far as the communication, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, sir. I'm referring to your report. There is a submission October 28, 2021 from Jose Cortez requesting various tasks to be done?
Yes.
Okay, and then there's another one, 12/14/2021. Same thing. So he's your liaison that goes back and forth between the sheriffs and yourself, and he makes those requests.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, So you got permission to possibly destroy this revolver permanently. They gave that to you.
I received permission to conduct the test.
And you made it aware to them that this could destroy the weapon.
Yes.
Okay. When you did destroy that, you broke several internal parts.
Yes.
Okay. And then we saw that on the exhibit. You took those apart to show what had happened. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, you also said that you did not see any modifications as to that firearm, correct?
At what point?
You testified that in your functionality examination, you also determined whether it had been modified or not.
Right, so that's generally in regards to things like, has the barrel been cut? Has the stock been cut? Has this been modified to fire fully automatic? So when I talk about modifications, that's what I'm referring to, and I did not see any of those things.
Okay, and as far as internal modifications, did you look at that?
No, because I can't disassemble the firearm because I have to test it in the condition it's received.
Okay, but from your viewing it and your observation, you didn't notice anything that would tell you it was modified?
Right, nothing jumped out immediately.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned that the full cock notch, which was the one we saw in that picture, kind of a little circle. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay, sir, you said that it looked a little flatter potentially?
Compared to the quarter and half cock, yes, it didn't have as much of a claw shape to it.
But you could not, you did not conclude that had been modified. You're not certain it had been modified.
Right, I'm not certain. It's a very small surface that we're talking about, so it's possible, it may have been modified, it may have been damaged during the exam, or it could also be one of the firearms that just doesn't have a very pronounced sear notch there.
Okay, so you just don't know for sure.
Correct, I don't know.
Okay. Now, I want to turn to the rounds. One of the things I heard you say several times is there's 4 components to determine a live round. Is that right, sir?
Yes, a live cartridge has 4 main components.
And you said the case, the projectile or bullet, the primer, and then the powder.
Correct.
So, you also testified earlier that when you
Yes, I am,
were given
Yes, I am.
presumed live rounds, but you did not disassemble them, you could not confirm they were live because you didn't get inside to see the powder.
Right, so there were certain cartridges that, again, I discussed this plan with the case agent, the contributor, to try to figure out which one we needed to take apart. So there was a subset that we concluded needed to be disassembled. So, for example, the ones that were presumed to be live, we needed to see what was on the inside.
He couldn't tell for certain, but
however, they sent
he did
quite
make
a
it
few
clear that
live, presumed
in the
live
condition
cartridges.
it
So
came to his lab, it would
it
have
didn't make
required
sense
a
to take
trigger
apart
pull.
every single piece of ammunition
Not
that they
good for
sent
Alec
in. So
Baldwin.
we came up with a sampling plan to where we just determined we were going to take apart some of them as a representative sample.
Sure, and I guess my question too was, you can't tell something is a live round until you make that final step to determine if there's powder inside.
Yes, that is true.
Okay, so you could not, for example, in your FBI training, you could not look at a picture and determine that's definitively a live round.
I wouldn't do that based on a photograph, no.
Okay, and that's part of your FBI training, that you would have to go through the 4 components, take it apart, make sure there's powder, and that's what gives you the confirmation, correct?
I would say yes. In order to know for sure, you would have to be able to see the powder, yeah.
Okay. That's how you've been trained.
I would say it's training related to ammunition and just understanding the components of the ammunition.
Okay. Now, as part of this also, you identified
Thanks, Dolores.
rounds that were
I will
live.
be.
And those were items, we saw
they
it on the
happen.
last slide, items 1B, 4 through 7. Is that correct?
Those aren't the 1B numbers, I don't believe. It's the lab numbers. And it was items 4 through 7 and 13-1.
You're right. I'm
You'll
sorry.
also be on
yeah, it was 4
standby.
through 7
I'm
and
going to be
13-1.
hopefully
Correct.
Were the lives, okay.
doing an
later
interview with
in
Tyrone
December,
Tucker as well. So we're going to
received a
get him
request
up,
from
I hope,
Mr.
as well,
Cortez, Agent Cortez, to conduct
before
DNA
he goes to
testing.
trial again.
Is that right? Your lab did?
I'm not completely certain of that.
Objection foundation.
And I can ask you a question on that, Your Honor.
Okay.
Does that request for DNA testing go to you, or does it go to another person in your lab?
I'm going to object to foundation again. If he doesn't know what request he's talking about, he can't answer.
Can you be more specific?
Yes. And I can show you, sir, the report.
I'm objecting to foundation. Why are you showing him a report that he hasn't seen?
You haven't seen your own report? Have you seen your own report?
My report was
No, I
not
don't know
included
Tyrone
related to
personally.
DNA, so I'm not sure what
I
report you're
discovered
referring to.
Tyrone when his
Okay,
trial
I'm just
started in
referring to the
January,
submission
but I reached out to
to
him
the FBI
and,
lab by
in
Jose
regards
A.
to getting
Cortez, dated
information and documents.
12/14/2021.
And,
And did you see that?
he and I have been in
I'd have to look
contact
at it.
Okay.
on and off.
If I may
and,
approach, Your Honor?
there's been interest
Are you having a
expressed in
problem with it?
the comment
Okay.
sections of videos I've done on him
Sir,
that
I'm going to show you.
people would like to see him come on and us have a conversation, and he indicated to
If you
me
can
that
just
he would
look at it,
definitely be
don't
willing to
tell
do
us
that.
what it is, but just read it to yourself.
Of course, he's busy right now getting things ready to go for trial, but we're going to try to set that up so that we can have a conversation and give my viewers a chance to speak. I wanted to get a few videos out
Is your
because
memory now refreshed on that?
one of the
So
things
that
I don't
is
like
not my
that happens to
report.
him
That is
is he'll
an
get asked a
electronic
question
communication from the field
that
office.
takes
of
hours
the
to answer,
case agent being Jose
and people
Cortez.
expect him to come up with
Okay,
a
and
3-minute
you're not-
response.
you did not
So I
receive
wanted to
that
try to
personally?
get that information out on
Eventually
the
I received
channel,
that.
which I've
Okay,
done in a
so you
couple
have
videos.
Yes.
There's
Okay,
one
so
or
you
two
know
more
that
videos I'm
certain
putting out, and
standards
then I'm going
were
to
submitted in this case. Are you aware of
him up
that regarding
so that we can all
fingerprints
have
and
a
DNA?
conversation with him. And
I'm sure
And,
I've seen that, but that's
talk
not
with him
related
and
to my discipline, so that doesn't affect
let him-
my examination. So that's,
let him
I don't
speak
know
with
that
us and
that's
answer
not noteworthy
questions.
to me.
Okay,
And
so you
hopefully
reviewed it,
go
but
down
you
there
did
and
not participate
get
in
himself acquitted.
Correct.
that. And right as we're sitting right now, you don't know what was submitted in terms of the people and their standards. Is that right?
I do not.
Okay. With regard to the live rounds we were seeing on those exhibits earlier, did you measure the projectile tops on each of those rounds?
No, I did not.
And so you're not able to tell us whether there are differences at all or not in the size of those projectile tops?
When you say the top, you're talking about the flat portion?
The flat portion.
And you're referencing the diameter of that flat portion?
Correct.
No, I can't tell you if those are consistent. Just the shape is consistent.
Okay. When you took the powder out of the rounds, did you weigh that powder?
I don't believe I did.
Okay, so you're not certain whether the rounds were full of powder or partially full of powder or not?
I'm not.
Okay. Let me ask you, going back to the gun, I missed one question. Before you conducted that test fire, did you look in the barrel with a bore scope?
No.
Okay. With regard to the rounds that came from Seth Kinney, you were told on the, well, you have them in your report, and the Monroe Street address, you have no idea what time those were seized or what date those were seized?
I don't off the top of my head. That may be in the paperwork that was submitted, but I don't know that.
Okay. And you have no idea where Seth Kinney brought the rounds that he submitted?
I do not.
And he didn't submit them to you, correct?
No, we receive evidence from the case agents.
Okay. And you didn't personally conduct any fingerprint or DNA testing because that's out of your specialty?
That's correct. I did not.
Earlier you were talking about the different types of ammo from 126 Monroe Street. You recall that you were showing live, dummy, and blank, all three types?
Can you ask that question again?
Sure. As part of your examination of the rounds from 126 Monroe Street, you're aware that there were live rounds, blank rounds, and dummy rounds.
Objection. That misstates the facts that are already in evidence.
Let him answer the question.
Do you have specific item numbers that I can reference?
Well,
I can ask for clarification if that's helpful.
Sure, absolutely. We saw some exhibits from 126 Monroe Street, and if you want to look at your report to check out those items and determine if there were both live rounds, dummy rounds, and then if there were blanks.
Okay, may I answer your question?
Yes, sir.
So the ammunition that I have as being reported from that address includes items 28, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 37. And these were the cartridges that were submitted as being known live ammunition. Some of them I disassembled, but not all of them because there were too many. So all of these were either physically consistent with live ammunition based on their exterior appearance.
They actually did.
Or the ones that I
did that, and they said there were 200. There were 200 rounds found. 50 were live.
Okay.
So around 25%
Thank you for
were found
looking
live.
for that.
And they believe
Now,
those bullets came and were brought on the set by
with
Hannah
regard
Gutierrez.
to
That's why they
the
showed.
set, the live rounds you found on set, did you do any further testing on those with regard to the powder or anything like that, or is that out of your discipline?
That goes beyond my discipline. There was another unit that did some testing on the powder, but I can't testify to that.
Okay. Your Honor, may I have just a moment?
Well, the proof in the negligence is in the fact that she didn't follow protocols. In other words, every bullet that comes on set, there's never supposed to ever be a live. There's never supposed to be a live round on set, or if there is, they're supposed to be secured away from the dummy bullets, and she's supposed to shake them.
Mr. Ziegler,
I went through this
why
with another
not
witness.
Disassemble
She's supposed to
every round
shake
that
them
was
and check
provided
them,
to
and she
you
didn't do
was
that.
what I'm going to call
And
presumed live.
She has
Right,
claimed
there
she
were
didn't
hundreds
know there
of
were live rounds on the
submitted
set.
in total.
But
So, for instance, you may have one item
they have
number, but
proof.
that was an entire box of 50 cartridges.
Yeah,
So
see that there was a box
in
of
totality,
cartridges
just from
that
practical
she had
purposes
texted her
as well
father
as, what is the
about
result? What
ended up on the
impact
set,
will this have
and
on
they
the
were able to
result?
match it with the
It didn't
number on
make
the
sense
box.
to disassemble every single cartridge that was submitted.
Did you x-ray any of the ammunition that was provided to you that was presumed live?
Yes, I x-rayed every cartridge that was submitted.
You x-rayed every single cartridge.
I did.
So you didn't disassemble every single cartridge, but you x-rayed every single cartridge.
That's true.
What did the x-ray images tell you about those presumed live cartridges?
May I refer to...
Certainly.
I just wanted to verify. I did X-ray every cartridge, and what that told me is there were indicators in the dummy cartridges that I could see in the X-ray. So whether they would be the holes in the size of the cartridge case, I could see that on an X-ray, as well as some of them had metal BBs, so the metal BBs showed up in the X-ray. So the live cartridges, the gunpowder does not show up. That's not visible. But I didn't see any of those other indicators to suggest that they may be something else that, other than what they were reported as being.
Well, the report was basically
just
she
to be
was on a
clear,
previous
the
set.
dummy cartridges
And
that you examined and disassembled.
on that set,
there were no dummy
it's
cartridges.
common sometimes to
that
do
came
live
from
trainings on a set. In other
126
words,
Monroe
away from the
Street.
production, just to
That's correct.
show the
Every
actors how the
cartridge that
guns
I have
perform, the
as
kickback
being
on the
listed
guns,
from that
etc.
address was either
On that
consistent
previous
with being
set,
live,
which she was
or
on in
actually
Arizona,
disassembled it and it had the
there
components
were live
of being
bullets.
live.
She
And when you say consistent with being live,
brought that entire
not
set
only are
kit
you
with
talking
her.
about the
That's how they got on. And then, of course, I'm not
physical
sure if we're going to hear the
characteristics,
testimony,
but
but
also the
it
X-rays.
was believed that
That's true.
on
There
this
was no
set,
indication from the X-ray that they were
people
anything
were
else.
off to the
You
side shooting
testified on
live rounds
cross-examination
into the
that
valley or
of
into
those
the,
live rounds that were
you know,
provided to you, you took
just
a
as a
representative
fun thing to do as
sample,
target shooting.
and those were the ones that you disassembled.
Correct.
And
Can you tell us how
she
you
brought those on
decided
allegedly.
which
The
rounds
problem is
to
she didn't
include
secure
in your
them.
representative sample
She didn't
for
follow protocols to
disassembly?
keep them separate.
Right. So as I mentioned
And that's how they
before,
found in
working with
his
the
Alec
contributor,
Baldwin's.
there were certain ones that they needed to have disassembled, but then when it came to
I guess
to
he had
these
like a
exemplars, we agreed
holder
to do
for
a
his
random sampling. And
weapons
the way that I
or for his
chose that,
bullets.
it was random
And they
as
were
far as
supposed
the
to have all
item numbers
blanks,
go,
and they found
but I also
in there
looked
they
for
found one
cartridges that
bullet
had
that was
similar
live.
head stamps. So I was
So
trying to see if similar
it was just a
exemplars
mess.
might
They just
have
didn't
similar
have
features
any.
on the inside.
They weren't following protocols. It wasn't
In
organized.
any of the
So again,
presumed
go
live
back to that
rounds
video.
that you
She's
disassembled
freaking out and
after
saying, "I'm
putting
sorry.
them
Oh
into
my
your
God.
representative sample,
Oh my God."
did any of them turn out to be dummies?
Yes, there was actually one that from the exterior appearance and the X-ray, I didn't see any indication that it was a dummy round. And then after disassembling that, I found there was no powder, and you can see down into the primer pocket it was hollow, so it was an inactive primer. So there was one cartridge that was submitted that on the outside appeared live, but upon further inspection did not have the 4 components required to fire a cartridge.
Can you tell us what item number that was?
It was item 22.
And can you tell us what your understanding was in terms of the description, where item 22 came from? And specifically, I'd like to know, did it come from 126 Monroe or Mr. Kenny?
Item 22 is a cartridge from the item 20 box, which is a box with tape from the prop truck.
Thank you, sir. Do you have to measure those projectiles or bullets to be able to see that they are different than the projectiles in the live rounds from the movie set?
No, they have distinct shapes in morphology, and some of them have distinct coatings, such as one of the projectile was a nickel-coated hollow point bullet.
You can just see that with your naked eye.
You can, and the photographs with glare and the print quality may not show it as well, but if you had the bullets, the cartridge in your hand, you would be able to see distinct shapes.
All of the items that you had, that you tested, that you examined, when your testing is complete, what do you do with them?
They get packaged in their appropriate outer packaging, and then they get returned to the field through, we have a unit at the laboratory that helps us out with this called the Evidence Management Unit. So they basically inventory everything, make sure everything that's supposed to be there is still there, and they're the ones that ultimately return it to the field.
And when you say they return it to the field, does it go right back to the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office?
Typically, if it's associated with an FBI case, it's going to go to the FBI field office.
Do you know what happened in this case?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further.
All right, you're excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
The state calls Shannon Prince.
I'm to remind any witnesses in this case that haven't been called, except expert witnesses, to stay off the live stream.
Face the judge and raise your right hand.
Do you swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you'll give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
All right, have a seat talking to the microphone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you please state your name for the record?
My name is Shannon Prince. My last name is spelled Prince.
And where are you currently employed?
I'm currently employed at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia.
And what's your title at the FBI?
I am a physical scientist, forensic examiner.
How long have you been employed in the latent print discipline?
Over 19 years.
And are you a member of any professional organizations related to your employment?
Yes, I am. I'm a member of the International Association for Identification.
And do you instruct any courses in the latent print discipline?
Yes, I do. I instruct courses on latent print processing, which is using chemicals to develop latent prints, as well as post-mortem processing, which is using fingerprints to identify the unknown deceased.
And do you take proficiency tests as part of your ongoing work at the FBI?
Yes.
How often and how many?
I take one proficiency test each year in comparing prints, and I've taken one test every 5 years in processing latent prints.
Have you ever failed a proficiency test?
No, I have not.
All right. And are you a certified latent print examiner?
Yes, I am. I'm a board-certified latent print examiner with the International Association for Identification.
Great. Your Honor, at this time I move the court to recognize Ms. Prince as an expert witness in the area of latent fingerprint examination.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right, you're recognized as an expert in latent fingerprint examination.
Thank you. All right. Why don't you give us an idea about what your duties are as a latent print examiner?
I receive a variety of evidence from either FBI field offices or state, local, and tribal officers. I receive this evidence in the laboratory, and then I examine that evidence with a variety of chemicals, powders, or light sources. When I develop latent prints, I then compare those latent prints to known prints of individuals and come to conclusions. I may search those latent prints in a fingerprint database, such as a computer, to make identifications. And then I provide a report based on my results. I can also testify in the court of law on those results.
I guess they're going to try to
link. Can you explain to us what a known fingerprint is?
The defendant's fingerprints
on the palm side of your hand, you have these raised portions of skin called friction ridges. They form patterns on your hand. You also have them on the soles of your feet.
They want to link
in
her
order
to
to record
those
a known
to show
print, the finger is usually
for them
rolled
coming
in
on the
black
set.
printer's ink and then rolled on a contrasting white background, such as a fingerprint card, and that creates a known print. These days, it's often recorded by placing your finger on a flatbed
what they're
scanner,
alleging is she
and it
brought
creates a
the
digital
bullets
copy
on,
of
and
your
then
fingerprint.
she didn't
And you also mentioned latent
follow
fingerprints.
protocols,
What is a
which she knew
latent
there was live
fingerprint?
rounds on the set.
A latent print
Again,
is the
that's the
unintentional or
negligence,
chance reproduction
which
of your
then that
friction-rich skin
obviously
when you touch an
results in
object.
ending up in
When
Alec
you touch an
Baldwin's gun
object, you
and
may leave a
shoot
latent
somebody and
print.
kill somebody. And
It's often left
thereby
in the
she's
oils and
guilty.
sweat on your hand, but it can be left in other substances such as blood, dirt, grease, ketchup. It's often not readily visible and requires a forensic light source such as a laser, a chemical, or a powder to be made visible.
And how are fingerprints compared and identifications affected?
It's a 3-step process, which is called analysis, comparison, evaluation, or ACE, ACE, where I analyze latent prints, looking if they're suitable. Then I can compare those latent prints and known prints side by side, and then making an evaluation decision, where I can make one of 3 decisions. An identification decision, the latent print and known print were made by the same person. An exclusion decision, where the latent print and known print were not made by the same person. Or an inconclusive decision, where I don't have enough information to make a conclusive decision. Often this is times when a fingerprint card, like a known card, is smeared or smudged, or it has too much ink. I can't make a conclusive comparison because that print is too poor to make a conclusive decision.
Great. And when you receive evidence for latent print exams, what factors do you consider prior to starting your examination?
I look at what type of evidence it is. It could be a porous item, which means it's like paper, money, or cardboard. I also look if it's semi-porous, which is kind of a shiny cardboard. Or if it's non-porous, which is smooth or shiny, like aluminum, plastic, glass. So I look at what type of evidence it is to determine what chemicals or light sources I'm going to need. And then I look at the condition of the evidence. Is the evidence broken? Is it shattered? Is it dirty? Is it covered with something? Or was it previously processed in the field by a crime scene investigator? I look at all that in order to determine what exams I will do and how I will proceed with those exams.
Great. I'm going to show you what was previously marked as State's Exhibit 63. And let's see. Do you recognize that photograph?
Yes, I do.
Have you actually seen the original version of what that photograph demonstrates before?
Yes, I have.
All right. And where did you see that?
I saw that back at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia.
All right. And did you examine Exhibit 63 for latent prints?
Yes, I did.
All right. What specific examinations did you conduct on this item?
So this item of evidence is an ammunition box, and it's semi-porous, meaning it's shiny paper, but it also has non-porous qualities. So the first examination I do is simple visual examination, looking to see if there's any visible prints. You do this every day when you see fingerprints on your cell phone or on a garage door or a mirror. That's a visual examination. So I first do that exam. And then I take this box into a dark room where I have a green light or a laser, a blue light or an ultraviolet light, and I shine that light on the object while I'm wearing orange or yellow goggles to see if any prints may fluoresce. At this point, I've used no chemicals on this item. The next process I use is called superglue fuming, where I place this item in a chamber, I hang it in a chamber, and then in the chamber I heat superglue at a high temperature. The superglue starts to fume. It starts to appear like white fumes. Those fumes adhere to any kind of moisture that might be on that object, and it creates a white print. And I can either see that print visually, or I need a reflective ultraviolet light to be able to see those prints. Then I also do a magnetic powder right after that process. The magnetic powder is black, since it's the white box, so it's contrasting. And I can see if there's any visible prints that way. The black magnetic powder, adheres to the white superglue prints. And then I take this box and use a chemical called indane-dione, I-N-D-A-N-E-D-I-O-N-E. This is a chemical that is sprayed on the item, and then it is placed in a humidity chamber where a chemical reaction is sped up. This chemical develops any kind of amino acid that may be in your sweat, and it creates a pink or orange print. And I can see that print either visually or in a dark room with a light source. And finally, I take a fluorescent dye stain and I spray this orange chemical on this box, and it adheres to those superglue prints as well, and I can see those prints in a dark room with an ultraviolet light or a laser.
And just to be clear, you did all of that, you did all of those tests with regard to the box that's in this photograph, correct?
Yes.
All right, and what was the result of your testing?
On this box, I developed 10 latent fingerprints.
All right. Did you compare the latent prints that you detected on Exhibit 63 to the known prints of any individuals?
Yes, I
So
did.
I was
So
right.
which
That is
individuals
exactly
did you
what they're
compare
trying to
those
do,
known
is link
prints
the
to?
box
I
that
compared
had
these
the live
prints
rounds
to
in it.
Hannah Gutierrez, Sarah Zachary, David Halls, and Alec Baldwin.
And did you find a match?
Yes.
Who did you find a match for?
2 of these latent prints were identified to Hannah Gutierrez.
All right. And were you able to find matches to any of the other known samples?
No.
All right. And were you able to exclude any of the other individuals based on your test?
The remaining prints were excluded as being prints from Sarah Zachary, David Halls, and Alec Baldwin.
And it's that box is how they
did
believe
you also examine
the
a second ammunition
live
box as part of
ammunition
this
got
case?
on set,
Yes.
and they have proof of that in a text message, so
Does
they
this
can now
appear to be
link
a
that to
photograph
her.
of that box?
And if she
It
knew
is.
there were live
All right.
rounds in there, and she didn't check and follow protocols for when
Oh,
live
I
rounds is on the
apologize.
set,
This is
boom.
State's Exhibit
Hence,
48.
again, back to that video.
Where did you
This
see
tells
this
you
box
why she
prior
reacted
to
how she
today?
did, why she was saying
At the
sorry.
FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia.
All right. And did you examine this box for latent prints?
Yes, I did.
And did you conduct the same type of analysis that you did on the previous box?
Yes. The examinations I conducted on this box were the exact chemicals, light sources, and powders that I used on the previous box.
Great. And what was the result of your examination of this box?
There were 3 latent fingerprints detected on this box.
All right. And were you able to compare those latent prints to the known samples of any individuals?
Yes.
And who were those folks?
I compared the 3 latent fingerprints to Hannah Gutierrez, Sarah Zachary, David Halls, and Alec Baldwin.
And did you find any positive matches for any of those individuals?
There were no identifications.
Were you able to find any exclusions?
Yes. Sarah Zachary and Alec Baldwin were excluded from the 3 latent prints detected on this item, and Hannah Gutierrez and David Hall were inconclusively compared to these prints.
All right. So just to be clear, Sarah Zachary, you didn't find her fingerprints on this box whatsoever?
The 3 latent prints were excluded from being Sarah Zachary.
Great. Is it possible to touch an item and not leave a latent print?
Yes.
And what kind of circumstances might that occur?
There are several circumstances where you can touch an item and not leave a latent print. First of all, you could be wearing gloves or a mitten, and when you touch an object, you may not leave a latent print because your skin is not having contact with that object. You may have too much sweat or too little sweat on your hand, and that may not leave a latent print. The surface itself may be dirty or textured, and it's difficult to leave a latent print on a dirty or textured surface. The print may be on a surface where if it's overhandled, such as if I put my hand here, and the next person comes and put their hand here, someone at the end of the day puts another hand here, it's overhandled, and that could wipe away any prints that may be on an item. There's also environmental conditions, wind, rain, snow, heat and humidity. Those can all play a factor of whether a latent print is detected on an item.
And did you attempt to do any examination of cartridge casings in this case?
Yes.
And what was the result of that examination?
I examined 4 cartridge cases, and there were no suitable latent prints detected on those cartridge cases.
And is it unusual for you to be unable to identify a latent print on a cartridge casing?
It is not unusual.
And why not?
Cartridge cases, when they go through a firearm, there's a lot of heat and friction, and that can destroy a latent print. Also, it's a very small surface that's on a cartridge case, so leaving a suitable print can be difficult. And it's also a smooth surface, so any kind of movement that comes into contact with a cartridge case may destroy a print on a cartridge case.
Great. Have you worked on any other cases where there were a large number of cartridge casing rounds that you attempted to examine for latent prints?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us an example of a case where you worked and explain to us, based on the number of casings that you found, how many actually were found to contain latent prints?
A case that I have been a part of was the Las Vegas shooting several years ago, where there was a significant amount of firearms, ammunition, and magazines in that case. Specifically to the ammunition, which consisted of shot shells as well as cartridges, we processed and examined over 6,900 pieces of ammunition, where we only detected 26 prints on those 6,909 ammunition. That's 0.38%, so it's a very low chance of developing prints on ammunition. We also processed firearms in that case. We processed about 40 firearms in that case, and we detected prints on 12% of those firearms. And then we processed over 180 magazines in that case, and we only detected prints on 9.7% of firearms. So it's a very low chance of getting prints on firearms or ammunition based on the size of the item, the texture of the item, as well as overhandling of those items. Those are all reasons why there's a low recovery rate on firearms and ammunition.
Thank you. And the 4 cartridge casings that you attempted to do fingerprint examination in this case, on your notes, does it indicate what the source of those cartridge casings was?
I'd have to refer to my notes for the specific source of those cartridge cases.
Do you mind?
May I?
Yes.
I don't have a specific source. I just have the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office item number.
Do you mind providing that?
It's item 144.
Okay, thank you. I have nothing further.
Cross-exam.
Ma'am, good morning.
Good morning.
With regard to your work, when you compare a Latin print against a standard, you were given those standards from the agency. For example, here the sheriffs, correct?
Yes.
So here you had 4 people as standards. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was Mr. Halls, Sarah Zachary, Alec Baldwin, and Hannah Gutierrez Reed. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so one of those people you did not receive standards from is a guy named Seth Kinney, correct?
Correct.
And so of all the other people on the set, the only 4 you received standards from were those 4.
That is correct.
Okay. And those standards included fingerprint cards and DNA?
The standards I received were fingerprints and palm prints from Gutierrez, Zachary, and Halls, and I only had a fingerprint card for Alec Baldwin.
Okay, you didn't have a palm print for him?
I did not.
Now, I know that you had stated that Halls and Hannah Gutierrez Reed, Mr. Halls and her prints were not completely rolled, or they were over-rolled?
Correct. Their known standards were not complete. There was some over-inking in one area, and when a fingerprint card is fully rolled, it's usually from nail to nail, where you can get the whole finger. This case, on some of these standards, the finger wasn't fully rolled completely. Therefore, I did not have enough information to do a conclusive comparison.
So when you don't have that completely rolled from the agency submitting to you, it's difficult for you to do a conclusive comparison.
It does make it difficult.
Okay. And that was the case here with Ms. Gutierrez Reed and with Mr. Halls?
Yes, it was.
With regard to the prints that you were able to conclude, and you indicated Ms. Gutierrez Reed's prints were found on one of the boxes?
That is correct.
Now, you were able to conclusively do that because?
I was able to conclusively do that because some fingers had that comparable area. So if there was an area that I can compare completely, I can make that conclusive decision. And in those 2 identifications, I was able to conclusively compare and make an identification.
And with regard to the other box that we saw, you found 3 Latin prints.
That's correct.
And you indicated that Ms. Zachary and Mr. Baldwin were excluded, correct?
Correct.
And that Mr. Halls and Ms. Gutierrez Reed were inconclusively compared, is that correct?
That is correct.
And that was because, again, you told the jury that you didn't have a complete, well-rolled set of fingerprints.
That is correct.
All right. And that would have been something the agency, the sheriffs would have provided?
Those standards came directly from the sheriff's office.
Did anybody ever communicate with you, and was there communication regarding we need new fingerprint standards?
There was no communication. In my report, I indicated that if further comparisons needed to be conducted, that standards would have to be submitted.
In your report, and if you need to refer to it to refresh your memory, you did not conduct fingerprint analysis on items 4 through 7 and item 13.1, correct?
I'd have to refer to those specific numbers.
Absolutely.
You said 4 through 7?
4 through 7 and 13.1. 13-1.
I did not conduct examinations on those items.
Okay. So the ones that you conducted it on, we've seen today.
Yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to the case you worked on, the Las Vegas shooting, you talked about the low percentage and the ability to recover prints from fired cartridges, correct?
From all types of ammunition.
Okay. Now, with regard to unfired ammunition, they don't go through that heat of the barrel, correct?
That is correct.
And so does that make it more likely prints can be found on those cartridges?
The same percentage refers to that as well, less than 1%. It's due to overhandling of cartridges or shot shells, the surface, the smooth surface, and a variety of other reasons that it could be a low chance of recovering prints on unspent cartridges.
On unspent cartridge, okay, but it is possible, even very low possibility, it is possible to recover them.
It is.
Okay. And you have listed there's certain elements that might come into that, like overhandling, that kind of thing. For example, the box you said earlier, that was handled by another unit?
The box, what specific box are you talking about?
Oh, I'm sorry, not the box. I was talking about, you mentioned in your report that there was some overhandling and one of your employees came up as contributing 8 fingerprints to one of the items.
Correct. One of the boxes was sent to the firearms unit first, which is usually on the latter end of examinations when it flows to the laboratory, but this box came in, it was specifically for that unit. And then after the firearm examinations were conducted, the request was to do latent prints, so it was kind of backwards in order. Therefore, this item of evidence was handled by the firearms unit, and a firearms employee was identified on that box.
And that was 8 of the prints out of a total of 10 or 11 were the employee, right?
8 out of 10 were identified to an FBI laboratory employee.
And ideally, that should have gone to you first?
In a regular case, the evidence is usually where it goes to a unit that can have less destructive examinations on it to more destructive. That's how it kind of moves to the laboratory. And this box initially went to the firearms unit first.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
I just have one quick question for you. Mr. Bowles mentioned items 4 through 7 and 13-1. Can you tell the jury why you weren't able to perform a print comparison on those cartridges?
I do not. Are they cartridge cases? I don't have them in my report, so I never received those items.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
All right, you're excused. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We're going to take our lunch break now. All right, so be back downstairs at 12:30. Please don't talk among yourselves or anyone else about the evidence received here in court. Thank you. Take your tablets with you.
All rise for the jury.
All right. So again, I not good for the defense at all today, in my opinion, so far. Good witnesses for the state. They're linking her to the live rounds. They're I think relatively easily going to be able to show that she didn't follow protocol on the set. The only thing they're doing is there is reference to a gentleman that I think they're going to try to say was potentially responsible or more responsible than her because of the fact that although she was listed as the armorer, she's going to say she was more responsible for props because they gave her double the responsibility, and as a result, she kind of shifted her responsibility and focus away from being the official armorer, and that there was another person that was ahead of her who had kind of taken on those responsibilities. So I think that's how the defense is going to try to get around this and say, who was really responsible. However, if she brings on live ammunition, she knows it's there. She was responsible that day for certain things that were going on. That's damning. So we're on lunch break. I guess it'll be back in about an hour. Now, before we end for lunch, we're going to go back, and I am going to finish playing the Paul Ferguson sentencing. There's a few minutes left of that, and then we're going to call ourselves a lunch break. So give me a moment to relink back into that video. And I believe we're up and running. We are. All right. So let's go back over and watch that, and then we'll go on lunch break.
And I thank him for doing such a detailed analysis. So the first concern of the court was whether or not Mr. Ferguson was suffering from some sort of intellectual disability, whether it be autism or something else. And there's a couple references to that throughout his Dr. Shades' report. And specifically, the first reference that the court had highlighted was on page 2 of the report's first full paragraph, and it says, in my opinion, he, referring to Mr. Ferguson, was clearly either psychotic or suffering from symptoms of a mood disorder at the time of the court interview. And he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at this time. Thus, in my opinion, he does not.
Yes, thank you, Dolores. Thanks for stopping by. Hopefully we'll see you later. And stop back in and say hello. Like I said, we're going to be ending this particular AM live, and we'll be back up live again around 2:30. So
thus,
see you there.
He's referring to Mr. Ferguson. His educational history is inconsistent with him suffering from intellectual deficits, and as noted above, he was apparently functioning within at least the normal range of intellectual ability at the time of the court interview. In my opinion, the defendant clearly does not suffer from an intellectual disability. So the court, that was helpful in the court because in some of the letters that I received as well, Mr. Roberts indicated that there was concern that Mr. Ferguson was autistic. And I think probably more toward that was easier to maybe manipulate him and that kind of thing. And certainly the court does take someone's intellectual capacity into consideration. I think it's important to understand the full situation. So the court, and although those are two small portions of the opinion that the court referenced, they're borne out by much more in detail history in Dr. Shazer's report. Specifically, Dr. Shazer analyzed every statement that the defendant gave to the police. He also watched the testimony of Mr. Ferguson, interviewed him himself. He also looked through his history from the Oklahoma Department of Health and Human Services. He looked through his history from school records, from various psychological assessments that were conducted throughout his life based on the report. So I think that opinion is well grounded in not only his interview, his review of educational records, his review of mental health records, and everything else, Health West records currently from when he was assessed when he became in Muskegon County Jail. So the court finds that to be quite persuasive in terms of whether or not Mr. Ferguson is suffering from any intellectual disability. And the court concludes based on this report, well-written report, well-grounded in fact and history of the defendant, that he was not suffering from an intellectual disability currently or at the time of this offense. The second thing is whether or not Mr. Ferguson was somehow manipulated or coerced by his mother. I think all of us would like to believe that this is a product of manipulation, that this is simply somebody doing something that they were told to do, that they were afraid. Mr. Eldon Brady mentioned it in his allocution regarding the specific text messages. Well, those specific text messages I heard as well at the trial. Shortly after the trial concluded, I asked the prosecutor's office for a complete copy of every single text messages that would occur between Ms. Vander Ark and Mr. Ferguson, because I didn't want just the snippets, the kind of highlights, or the real juicy stuff, for lack of a better term. I wanted to understand completely what the conversation was between these individuals. I read every single text message, every one of them. I think there's thousands in there, and I've read it 3 times now. 3 times in total. I read it 2 months ago, I read it a month ago, and I read it last week Friday. The entire afternoon was spent reading through these things, and I think it's clear to me that Mr. Ferguson, although he says that he was scared of his mother, or there's an allegation of that standpoint, I find that just the opposite to be true based on those text messages. There is some mention about punishment, but I think Mr. Ferguson, in my opinion, being submissive, for lack of a better term, to his mother was a result that he really had nowhere else to go. He had been kicked out from his father's house for failing to obey his father's rules and for other things. And he went to his mother's house, and I don't think Mr. Ferguson really had anywhere else to go. I think he was sort of beholden to his mother in terms of, well, there's going to be consequences. Although there are some text messages, 1 or 2 of those, that bear that out, this strikes me in the text messages as more of a collaborative effort. In fact, there's some text messages where Ms. Vander Ark actually tells Mr. Ferguson that if Ms. Timothy does not behave, essentially, I'm going to leave him to you, as in that he's going to let the dog out and just log off the chain. And Mr. Ferguson also several times essentially tells his mother things that are going on that are bad. And I think it's because he wants his mother to give him the permission to go ahead and engage in punishment. So in terms of whether or not his mother, he was somehow afraid of his mother, I don't think that to be the case. Now, that was my initial feeling about it, and what I took it as, and that's why I wanted the assessment regarding whether or not he was being manipulated. And luckily, we did get one from the second one I referenced, which was from Dr. Farhat, which is specifically, I think he was asked to assess this particular question. And in the beginning of his assessment, he says that specifically, I was asked to assess whether Mr. Ferguson possessed a psychological disorder of traits that would render him significantly susceptible to manipulation, coercion, or suggestibility. After conducting the evaluation, I could not substantiate these traits as they pertain to the commission of the offense. As such, this report will instead explain the nature of the evaluation and my overall opinions regarding Mr. Ferguson's psychological functioning. He also opined regarding his intellectual abilities. He says, from a diagnostic standpoint, I did not find sufficient evidence to support Mr. Ferguson meeting criteria for any specific mental disorder. While one may consider whether his presentation suggested a neurodevelopmental condition, for example, e.g. autism spectrum disorder, I did not find this to be an appropriate label. Instead, I attributed his overall demeanor and presentation to factors such as a lack of socialization, normalization of abnormal dynamics and experiences, poor interpersonal skills, and emotional dysregulation. He also indicated later on that page that I was initially asked to evaluate whether Mr. Ferguson had a mental condition or traits that would have rendered him susceptible to coercion, manipulation, or suggestibility at the time of the offense. Ultimately, I could not arrive at this conclusion based on the totality of available information. Available evidence noted that he was capable of appreciating the abuse towards his brother, that he was capable of recognizing the detrimental impact it had, and that he at times disobeyed Ms. Vander Ark and tried to provide his brother with aid and support. Furthermore, despite reporting that he was under Ms. Vander Ark's, quote, psychological hold, he adamantly denied that he was coerced or manipulated into enforcing the abuse. Additionally, he recognized to some degree pleasure in having power and control over his younger brother. In this sense, while I acknowledge that he reported experiencing fear and concerns of disobeying Ms. Vander Ark, I could not reliably substantiate his involvement as being a byproduct of suggestibility or coercion. So what this court is left to conclude is that Mr. Ferguson, the way I look at this is that Mr. Ferguson in these reports, and a lot of these, throughout the report, there's talk about how Mr. Ferguson bullied his brother when he was younger. There's a mention, his stepsister, who I think was allocated on behalf of his mother, or on behalf of Timothy at Miss Vander Ark's sentencing. This is the stepsister, and this is before the police even really told her about exactly what had happened in here. It says the stepsister reportedly told the police that, quote, she doesn't know how involved Paul was in this situation, but he is the biggest bully she has ever met in her life, and he found genuine joy in tormenting Timothy whenever possible.
Judge, for clarification, I don't think that was Millie, that the
Okay,
stepsister.
so maybe
is not
I'm wrong.
Millie.
Okay, so perhaps I'm wrong about that. But this was someone who, without even knowing the full details, reported that. In one of the interviews, Mr. Ferguson indicated that he liked getting praised by Shonda and admitted he liked having control over Timothy. He reportedly admitted having power over somebody feels good. Later in the interview, I asked him whether he had felt ashamed at the time when he was abusing his brother, and he said, quote, no, he had not. I asked whether he had recognized his action as morally wrong at the time, and he again said, quote, no, he had not. He then volunteered that on one occasion, quote, I sent her a photo of how thin he was, and when I asked why he did this, he explained that I was worried. When asked when he was worried about Mr. Ferguson, Ferguson replied that he had been concerned for his health, observing that he was nothing but bones. I asked him whether he had, at the moment, thought that this abusive behavior was wrong, and he replied that, quote, that thought never even crossed my mind. A treatment plan back from July 22nd of 2012 indicates that, quote, client, meaning Mr. Ferguson, sometimes bullies his younger brother, the decedent, Timothy. The report also mentions cruelty to animals, stealing, abuse. His mother at the time, back in 2018, told staff at the clinic he's become bossy, telling his siblings what to do. For Mr. Ferguson's part, reportedly, when commenting about his being irritable, he admits that this is due to his younger siblings not listening. He gets physically aggressive towards his younger siblings. He also tried to lock his younger brother, i.e. apparently a reference to the decedent, in the closet because his brother wouldn't listen to him. So the court read this and certainly looks at this as someone who is predisposed, I think was the ultimate conclusion, predisposed to abuse his brother. Specifically, the victim in this case, in a history of doing that. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that Mr. Ferguson is a result of years and years and years of physical neglect and abuse on behalf of his mother. No doubt in my mind that's borne out in this report. But the court is asked to essentially ignore the decisions or his behavior because of that, and to somehow say that we're going to minimize the damage and what he did in this case because of that. If the court started imposing that standard, I think we would be in real trouble, because every defendant that comes before this court has a horrible history, I would say. That's the reason they're here. People that have supportive parents and things go good for them typically don't come here. Now, that's not always the case, believe me, there's a lot of interventions, but everybody has a history. And what I was looking at is whether or not this is a product of his mother or his situation, and what I can conclude is that this is not. Mr. Ferguson is trying to shift blame from his mother, from him to his mother, to say that somehow, well, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have done this, or she's the one that did this. At the trial, well, at her order, he kept saying it over and over and over again, as it just keep underscoring the point. And if that had been an isolated incident, if that had been one or two of these things, if that had been a punishment that he administered, maybe the court could accept that. But we have an individual who was in a household for 6 months, intentionally himself engaging in torture of another person. And he doesn't, well, I'm worried about my mom's going to say, clearly it's not borne out in these reports. He had the ability to disobey his mom. In fact, he was on the stand and almost boasted that, well, I gave him extra food. Weren't you worried about how your mom was going to be upset? I still gave him extra food. So what that tells me is that this has been a careful, manipulated story by Mr. Ferguson from the very beginning of this thing, that he's going to put the blame on his mom. I'm going to be manipulated. I have Asperger's syndrome. I have autism. I have Stockholm syndrome. There's mention of him saying, well, maybe I have Stockholm syndrome in here. No, this is an individual. What the truth of this is that we have two individuals that lack empathy, who lack emotion, and both of them, the triggering factor in this report, the triggering factor that caused this abuse was the removal of the husband, of stepdad. Once he was gone, these two individuals were free to torture somebody, and they did it. That's what they did. And I think Ms. Vander Ark did use Mr. Ferguson. I think that she knew from his history that he was predisposed to torment Timothy. I think that she knew that he would have no problem doing that. And Mr. Ferguson walked through that door and was happy to be the enforcer, was happy to do it, and continued to torture his brother over and over and over and over until he was a shell of a person, until he was dead, died from starvation, died from hypothermia. He had no fat on him, barely any muscle on him. And the whole time, just letting it happen. The report says, it appears that the stepfather's presence in the home had prevented Paul and his mother from abusing the victim. Again, it wasn't anything to do, they were just holding him back, essentially. The overall opinion, which I think is important, is, in my opinion, although the defendant's participation in the abuse was in a part a function of his social milieu and living situation, these contextual factors were not a necessary condition for his participation. As previously noted, mental health records contain information to the effect that while they were still living with their father and stepmother, and reportedly had no contact with their mother, Mr. Ferguson's stepmother told the psychiatrist that he had become bossy, telling his sibling what to do, and the defendant himself that he would become irritable due to his younger siblings not listening. He gets physically aggressive, told his younger sibling. He also reports that he's gotten irritated with his siblings and has pushed them in retaliation. He's also tried to lock his younger brother, the decedent, in the closet because his brothers wouldn't listen to him. Consistent with this, Norton Shores Police Department documents indicate that Mr. Ferguson's stepsister told police, quote, he is the biggest bully she's ever met in her life, and he found genuine joy in tormenting Timothy whenever possible. when they were living in the biological father's home. Notably, the defendant allegedly engaged in this abusive behavior despite there being any safety rules in place, and despite his father and stepmother disapproving of this behavior to such an extent that they removed him from their home once he turned 18 because of it. In my opinion, Paul Ferguson was predisposed to abuse his brother, independent of his mother's present and active influence in his life. Nonetheless, in my opinion, Mr. Ferguson's involvement in repeated acts of abuse that amounted to physical and psychological torture over a period of months reflects a general lack of empathy for his brother and a lack of remorse for his actions. Concludes that, in my opinion, there is no reason to believe that Mr. Ferguson's conduct disorder has remitted or that his participation in the abuse of his brother was not an expression of a persistent pattern of antisocial conduct. The court is concerned that Mr. Ferguson will not get the help he needs in prison. I think he's one step away from becoming a psychopath like his mother, and the court is concerned that he represents a danger to the public, that if released, he would represent a significant danger to the public. The charge here is child abuse, and I don't think this charge or the sentencing guidelines take into adequate consideration of the long sustained torture in this case. As I indicated in Ms. Vander Ark's testimony, there was a long period of months of various punishments, including bread with hot sauce. There's hot sauce that apparently contains 2 of the hottest peppers that we have in the world. Wall sits for an individual who practically had no muscle left. Running up and down stairs, cleaning out a garage with no pants on, sleep deprivation in itself. Putting alarms on him so he couldn't move or sleep. Making him puke up food. There's bathroom timers. Sleeping in the closet with a tarp down, which quite frankly might be considered animal abuse. But we have a human being here. Making his hands over his head. And then at the end of his life, an 8-hour practically ice bath that killed him. So no, I don't think any of those things are adequately taken into consideration by the guidelines. And I don't think the guidelines, quite frankly, can even, these guidelines don't justify Mr. Ferguson's actions. Mr. Ferguson, I think you are a product of your environment, but I don't believe you that you're sorry. I don't. I don't think you have empathy. I don't think you have any emotion whatsoever. And that's what scares the court. It really scares me. I think you're sorry that you're here. I think you're sorry you got caught. I don't think you wanted Tim to die either, like your mother, because you would get caught and you wouldn't torture him anymore. And believe me, I've tried to sit here and try to think, well, maybe Mr. Ferguson's not as bad as Mom. I think you're just as bad, if not worse. If not worse. Because you had a job. You could have, Mr. Johnson actually asked you, couldn't you have brought home a thing of food for him? You could have gone to a neighbor and said, hey, my mom's abusing him. You could have grabbed him and got him out of there. You could have done any number of things to stop this. And you chose not to. Your own brother. And this is where we're at. So, based on all that, it's a sentence of the court. You serve 30 years to 100 years, Michigan Department of Corrections. Credit for 592 days you've already served. Court's going to assess a $68 state cost, $130 crime-based assessment, no additional fines or costs. Mr. Ferguson, you have a right to file an appeal in this case. If you're finding if it's retained an attorney who will be appointed to a public expense. Request for the assistance of a lawyer must be made in 42 days from today's date. Clerk is handing you a form that you must complete. Return to the court in that 22 days if you wish to request the appointment of an attorney on appeal or adjourned. All right, what do you want to do next in the jail, Mr. Goins?
Most of them are jail, Judge.
What's that? Clinton?
All right, so that concludes the sentencing there. Like I said, we'd been watching that. Those of you who were not with us earlier, we'd started watching that on a break, so I wanted to finish that. But we are going to go on a little lunch break here, and then we will be back with the afternoon session. I do this mainly because I'm limited to 6-hour streams, so on my software that I use, so I have to kind of break it up, so it gives me a little break as well. So that's where we'll go from there. So I'm going to end the stream, guys. Appreciate everybody that tuned in, everybody that watched. If you haven't already yet, subscribe. Make sure you like the video. That helps get people in here to let them know that this is a video worth watching. Share it as well. And of course, we have memberships available right now. So check out our membership tiers. We've got 2 tiers of membership support that give you additional benefits. There's going to be streams and videos and things that are going to be members only. So definitely will be worth getting in there right now so that you have access to all of that. But check that out. And in the meantime, guys, like I said, we'll be back here, I guess, probably in about 30 minutes or so. So talk to you soon. Talk to you then. And until then, let justice prevail.